War, in its most brutal and unrelenting form, is a contest not only of armies and firepower, but of perception, of what each side sees, believes, fears, and miscalculates. And by 1944, as the Allies pushed deeper into Europe following the Normandy landings, it became clear that brute strength alone would not be enough to hold the fragile momentum against the Wehrmacht's ability to regroup, counterstrike, and adapt with terrifying speed. The front was a constantly shifting landscape of hedgerows, villages, forests, and rivers where every movement, every massing of tanks, every new artillery placement risked detection by German reconnaissance units whose aerial scouts prowled the skies day and night, hungry for signs of Allied buildup. The Germans had perfected their ability to interpret shadows, track tank tracks, analyze camp layouts, and decode patterns of troop distribution. They had spent years refining their battlefield instincts, and even in retreat, they were deadly, disciplined, and brutally efficient. In such an environment, deception was no luxury. It was oxygen. It was the difference between an advancing force and a devastated one, between seizing a crossroads and losing an entire division. And so, amid the thunder of artillery, the grind of armored columns, and the endless logistics of a continental campaign, the U.S. Army conceived a unit unlike anything any military force had dared create before. A mobile, shape-shifting, audio-visual illusion machine designed not to fight the enemy, but to warp their senses, confuse their scouts, disorient their commanders, and make entire divisions appear where none existed. In a war defied by tanks and bombers, this unit would wield paintbrushes, rubber, amplifiers, and imagination as its weapons. It would not kill. It would mislead. It would misdirect. It would become an army of ghosts, silent when real armies moved, loud when empty fields stretched barren, powerful when barely a dozen men stood in the mud. The idea did not emerge from traditional military doctrine. It was born from desperation mixed with brilliance, an understanding that deception could save thousands of lives by forcing German generals to defend against threats that were nothing more than illusions cast across the battlefield. High command knew the cost of moving divisions incorrectly, not just in fuel, but in time, manpower, strategic positioning. If the Germans could be convinced that a major U.S. armored force was assembling far from the true point of attack, if they could be fooled into repositioning their panzer divisions toward a phantom threat, if they could be made to see what was not there and ignore what was, then the Allies could strike with overwhelming precision at points where the enemy was weak, unprepared, and vulnerable. It was an elegant solution to a brutal problem, and yet it required skills far beyond typical military training. It demanded artists who understood perspective and scale, sound designers who could manipulate the battlefield with engineered thunder, set designers capable of recreating the suggestion of division-sized forces out of rubber and canvas, and radio specialists who could mimic the chatter of entire battalions. The U.S. Army scoured its ranks for creative minds, illustrators, painters, sculptors, sound engineers, architects, designers, and thinkers who saw the world not as it was, but as it could be made to appear. They were not hardened soldiers. Many had never fired a weapon in anger, but they possessed something far more valuable: the ability to invent convincing lies on a scale never attempted in modern warfare. And so the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was formed, though few would ever hear its true name. To the outside world, it was a small technical support unit. To those who understood its mission, it was a shape-shifting phantom force capable of projecting the illusion of 30,000 troops while never numbering more than 1,100 men. They were built to be everywhere and nowhere, to appear massive while remaining small, to conjure tank battalions out of empty fields in the span of a night and evaporate without trace by dawn. Their existence was so secret that even the units they were supporting rarely knew who they were. They drifted across the European theater like whispers, appearing on one road, disappearing down another, always staying just far enough ahead of the real divisions to mask their movements and draw German recon into traps of misinterpretation. Each mission began the same way. Intelligence officers would identify a sector where deception could alter the outcome of an operation, perhaps a river crossing where German artillery waited on the far bank, or a forest edge where the enemy anticipated an armored breakthrough, or a vulnerable flank where the real troops needed time to regroup. Then the Ghost Army would slip into position, often under cover of night, unloading their tools of illusion with practiced speed. Inflatable Sherman tanks that could be carried by 6 men yet looked convincingly formidable from the air. Rubber trucks arranged in neat columns. Artillery positions made from plywood and canvas. Tents erected to mimic the sprawl of a major encampment. Laundry lines strung with fake uniforms, and carefully carved tire tracks pressed into the soil to suggest heavy vehicle traffic. But visual deception was only one layer, and on its own, it might not stand up to scrutiny by German reconnaissance aircraft or forward observers watching through binoculars. So the Ghost Army paired it with sound. Massive 500-pound speakers mounted on half-tracks, capable of projecting audio recordings of tank divisions moving, engines rumbling, metal clanking, shouted commands, and the chaotic clatter of troops preparing for battle. These soundtracks were engineered with such precision that they created an immersive illusion of massed maneuvers, each acoustic pattern mapped to the terrain to trick German scouts into believing they were hearing authentic troop movements rather than a handful of men hiding behind speakers. And if the Germans tried to intercept radio traffic, they would hear perfectly crafted transmissions, fake messages stitched together by expert radio operators who studied the speech patterns, code habits, and operational rhythms of real units until they could impersonate them flawlessly. The deception was a 3-dimensional masterpiece, created and executed in real time under battlefield pressure, often with enemy artillery close enough that the men could hear shells landing on nearby hills. They knew that if the Germans discovered the illusion, the Ghost Army could be annihilated in a single afternoon. They had no armor, no artillery, no backup. Their mission was to provoke, to lure fire, to draw attention onto themselves in order to protect the real divisions positioned elsewhere. They were a shield made not of steel but of shadows, and each operation carried the weight of knowing that their survival depended on the enemy believing the lie. But perhaps what made the need for illusion so urgent was the nature of the enemy they faced. German reconnaissance was relentless. Storch observation planes skimming treetops, scouts perched on ridge lines watching for dust clouds, forward observers trained to interpret vehicle movement from miles away. They had spent years learning how to read the land and anticipate the Allies' next steps. They were not easily fooled. They looked for patterns, the spacing between parked vehicles, the density of tents, the number of latrines, the frequency of radio transmissions. Everything had to align for the illusion to hold, which meant every detail mattered. The distance between tanks, the placement of supply crates, the alignment of tracks in the mud, even the direction fake guns pointed. A single inconsistency, a tank parked too close to another, a sound loop repeating unnaturally, a radio operator using the wrong phrasing, could unravel an entire deception. So the Ghost Army worked with obsessive meticulousness. They studied real divisions, walked through authentic camps, recorded hours of vehicle movement, cataloged the visual habits of frontline troops, and rehearsed their illusions like actors preparing for a demanding play. But unlike a play, their audience was armed, hostile, and ready to kill. And as the Allies advanced deeper into Europe, the stakes only grew. Every mile closer to the German border meant denser defenses, sharper observation, and deadlier consequences for missteps. Illusion became not merely useful, but vital. A single deception could draw a panzer division 40 miles off course. A single phantom force could convince German generals to abandon a key town. A single night of audio deception could cause scouts to misreport troop concentrations, reshaping entire sections of the front. High Command recognized that the Ghost Army was not a novelty. It was a strategic instrument capable of altering the trajectory of the war. And as their missions accumulated, so did their confidence, skill, and reputation among the select few who knew they existed. They became the quiet guardians of the Allied advance, walking ahead of the real armies, creating shadows where there were none, painting threats out of thin air, turning forests into fortresses, fields into armored encampments, and riverbanks into staging grounds for invasions that would never come. The Ghost Army's story began not with a battlefield victory, but with the understanding that war is won by controlling perception, and perception can be bent by those who understand how to manipulate the senses. They were born from the need to deceive an enemy who saw too much, anticipated too well, and reacted too quickly. In the quiet before their first major operation, as the men stood among rolled-up rubber tanks and crates of painted artillery barrels, they understood their strange place in the war. They were soldiers of illusion, warriors of imagination, the invisible architects of victory. And in the months to come, they would prove that 1,000 fake tanks, 1,000 recorded engines, and 1,000 invented soldiers could save the lives of real ones, one illusion at a time. Building an army out of air required a choreography so precise, so layered, and so fluid that it resembled a strange fusion of battlefield engineering, theatrical set construction, and psychological warfare, each part dependent on the other to form a seamless illusion capable of deceiving veteran German reconnaissance teams who had honed their craft across years of war. The Ghost Army could not simply inflate a few rubber tanks and hope for the best. They had to build an entire world, a living organism whose every detail breathed with the rhythm of a real combat division. Because the Germans did not merely observe troop formations from afar, they dissected them with the scrutiny of surgeons, analyzing patterns in camp layout, the spacing between vehicles, the subtle cues of activity such as tire tracks, footpaths, trash pits, cook fires, and even the way tents sagged, depending on whether soldiers actually slept inside them. And so each time the Ghost Army deployed, they effectively constructed a military diorama so convincing that even frontline officers might momentarily doubt their own senses if they approached too close. The illusion began with terrain analysis, because the Ghost Army could not place their inflatable Shermans or rubber half-tracks arbitrarily. They had to read the land the way a real armored commander would, choosing positions that offered plausible routes for tanks to maneuver, natural cover for artillery, realistic spacing for supply depots, and lines of communication that made tactical sense. And so they walked through fields, forests, and river valleys, studying angles of elevation, wind direction, soil density, and sight lines, mapping out their stage like master set designers preparing for a performance in which the critics carried machine guns rather than notebooks. Once the terrain was chosen, the visual deception crews moved with astonishing efficiency, unloading their tools of illusion under the cover of dusk or the trembling light of early morning, when shadows lengthened and the enemy's aerial patrols were least likely to catch them unaware. Trucks rolled into position carrying enormous rubber bundles that, when unrolled and inflated with portable compressors, transformed into realistic Sherman tanks within minutes, large enough to throw convincing shadows, detailed enough to fool the eye from a distance, and sturdy enough to withstand wind, minor punctures, or reconnaissance planes that might swoop in for a closer look. Each inflatable tank weighed almost nothing when deflated, allowing a handful of men to move an entire armored column by hand, repositioning vehicles every few hours to simulate the natural restlessness of a division preparing for battle.
But visual persuasion did not end at the tanks because a real division did not consist merely of armor. It had fuel trucks, ammunition carriers, artillery units, field kitchens, repair depots, water purification stations, and scattered clusters of soldier tents arranged according to doctrine. And so the Ghost Army replicated each of these with the cunning of stage magicians, crafting plywood cannons that could rotate just enough to appear manned, constructing wooden trucks whose silhouettes fooled even trained aerial analysts, and erecting tent clusters with enough authenticity to satisfy the most skeptical observer, complete with fake laundry hanging on lines, crates arranged around cook fires that never burned, and pathways trampled into the ground by boots worn by the same soldiers who spent the night elsewhere, creating the illusion of constant activity in a camp populated by barely a dozen men. But a camp without sound was a dead camp, and German scouts knew the difference. So the sonic deception crew, experts in audio engineering, arrived with massive 500-pound speakers mounted on half-tracks, testing acoustics by firing bursts of engine recordings across the landscape to determine how sound traveled over hills, through forests, and across open fields. These were not ordinary recordings, but meticulously curated soundscapes captured from real armored divisions weeks earlier, layered with the roar of engines, the clank of treads, the grinding of gears, shouted commands from officers, and the chaotic orchestration of hundreds of men preparing for movement. The sound engineers adjusted frequencies so that bass rumbles could travel miles, giving the impression of heavy mechanized units gathering mass, while higher frequencies carried the chatter of soldiers and the metallic noise of equipment, creating a three-dimensional illusion that enveloped the landscape in an aura of imminent assault. And still, the illusion was incomplete without the invisible threads of radio, because German signal intelligence officers were among the most adept in Europe, capable of identifying specific units by their communication habits, code rhythms, and even the personal quirks of radio operators. So the Ghost Army created an entire parallel network of fabricated radio traffic operated by skilled signal technicians who had painstakingly memorized the communication styles of the divisions they impersonated, sending out streams of authentic-sounding messages to mislead German intercept teams into believing that entire battalions were present where only a handful of signal operators sat behind disguised trucks tapping out orchestrated fiction. They imitated not only tone and pattern, but also the frustrations, hesitations, and subtle errors that characterize real battlefield communications, making their transmissions indistinguishable from those of the units they sought to mimic. Layer by layer, the Ghost Army constructed their phantom divisions, a performance so complete, so enveloping, that it functioned as a psychological labyrinth for enemy commanders trying to parse the battlefield. But while the illusions looked flawless from a distance, their creators knew just how fragile everything was up close. One German patrol breaking through the line, one reconnaissance aircraft flying too low, one artillery barrage landing too close, and the entire deception could unravel catastrophically, exposing not only the fraud but the minuscule, lightly armed group of artists, engineers, and illusionists who had crafted it, men who carried rifles they hoped they would never need, and whose defense lay not in force but in secrecy, speed, and distance. Every time they built their phantom camps, they did so with the knowledge that their lives depended on maintaining the illusion until the real divisions had completed their maneuvers elsewhere, a ticking clock that pushed them to work faster, smarter, and often in dangerous proximity to the front lines. Even as they lifted inflatable tanks and hammered plywood artillery into place, they could hear the distant rumble of actual German guns, feel the tremors of tank engines through the ground, and see the flickering glow of firefights on the horizon. But their mission was never to fight. It was to distract, to manipulate, to distort the enemy's perception of reality so completely that German commanders made fatal decisions based on shadows. And as they refined their craft through repeated deployments, they developed a system so sophisticated that the illusion became almost second nature. First, they analyzed the terrain and the psychology of the enemy. Then they created the visual footprint of a division. Next, they layered in sound to match the visual cues. Finally, they wove a blanket of radio deception over the operation, broadcasting a fictional world into the airwaves. The result was an army that existed only in the mind of the enemy, an army built from air and imagination, its power drawn from the German belief that it was real. And belief, the Ghost Army understood, was the deadliest weapon in the world when wielded correctly. As their operations grew in scale and sophistication, they became ghosts not only in the sense of invisibility, but in the sense of haunting, lingering in German intelligence reports, shaping enemy troop deployments, luring divisions into pointless marches, and leaving commanders furious when they discovered that the forces they had been chasing for days simply evaporated into empty air. The Ghost Army had become a force of illusions capable of altering reality on the battlefield, and every time they deployed, they built not just an army out of rubber, wood, and sound, but an alternate version of the war itself, where perception trumped truth and where a handful of artists could redirect the path of armies with nothing but shadows.
Inflatable tanks and phantom artillery became the beating heart of the Ghost Army's visual deception, the most striking instruments of illusion that transformed empty meadows, quiet forest edges, and abandoned farmlands into what appeared to be formidable staging grounds for armored assaults. And to understand how profoundly these rubber monsters altered the course of the war, one must picture the tense battlefield environment of 1944. German reconnaissance pilots flying low over the European landscape, straining their eyes to detect even the faintest signs of Allied troop movements, while Allied advances pressed deeper into France and toward Germany. The skies buzzed with Luftwaffe scouts, scarce but deadly diligent, equipped with cameras capable of capturing the smallest of details from hundreds of feet above, and German analysts, trained through years of relentless Eastern Front warfare, would scour these photographs with surgical precision, identifying tank models, distinguishing fresh tracks from old ones, and noticing subtle indicators such as the spacing between vehicles or the angle of a barrel's shadow. Against such scrutiny, ordinary deception would fail, but the Ghost Army's inflatable tanks and phantom artillery were anything but ordinary. They were engineered with a level of detail, ingenuity, and battlefield awareness that made them nearly indistinguishable from the real vehicles they mimicked. When the Ghost Army arrived at a designated site, often under the cloak of darkness to minimize detection, they began the astonishing transformation of terrain with deflated rubber skins that, when laid out across the ground, looked like nothing more than grotesque shadows. Each inflatable Sherman tank was a marvel of design, folded into a bundle that 6 men could carry, yet capable of expanding into a 20-ton illusion with the simple hiss of air compressors humming through the night. As the tanks inflated, the ghostly shapes slowly emerged from the ground, their silhouettes forming recognizable turrets, hulls, and gun barrels, accurate enough in shape and proportion to fool even trained observers, especially when positioned strategically to catch the right angle of sunlight or cast the proper shadow along a ridge. The Germans had learned to read shadows to determine armor presence, so the Ghost Army used this knowledge against them, positioning inflatables in such a way that dawn and dusk light created long, convincing tank shadows stretching across the land, making the illusion even more powerful. These shadows became some of the most reliable allies the Ghost Army had. The sun itself became part of the deception, lending authenticity to objects made of nothing more than fabric and air. The process of deploying these tanks was a race against time. With every minute that passed, the risk of a German reconnaissance plane appearing overhead grew, and so the Ghost Army perfected the choreography. Trucks screeching to a halt, soldiers leaping out, tanks unrolled, pumps activated, each man knowing which corner to hold, which seam to straighten, which anchor to hammer into the soil to keep the rubber beast stable against the wind. Within an hour, a barren field could become the base of a full armored battalion. But tanks alone were not enough. Artillery was a critical component of any armored division's footprint. The Germans knew the patterns. Artillery was placed at specific distances behind armor, angled according to terrain and likely targets, camouflaged yet visible enough to confirm the presence of a serious fighting force. And so the Ghost Army constructed an entire arsenal of phantom guns, 105mm howitzers fashioned from plywood, lightweight enough for 2 men to carry, yet crafted with such geometric accuracy that from the air they resembled heavy iron artillery pieces. The barrels were carved from steel tubing or wood depending on supply.
The carriages were painted in matte olive tones to avoid reflective detection. Sandbags were arranged around them, their texture designed to mimic real fortifications, and camouflage netting was draped strategically to make them appear as though soldiers had prepared firing positions over days, rather than minutes. Sometimes the Ghost Army even created fake blast rings in the soil around these phantom guns. Clever circular scorch marks mimicking the darkened earth caused by repeated artillery discharges. These circles suggested long-term activity, tricking German analysts into believing artillery units had been stationed there for days or weeks. In some operations, the Ghost Army enhanced the effect with empty shell casings scattered near the guns, not real ones, but lightweight props carved from wood or shaped from tin, painted to mimic the brass sheen of spent rounds. Everything was placed with intention because everything was being watched. Meanwhile, to simulate weight, men used wooden rollers to press tank tread patterns into the mud, leaving behind convincing impressions of heavy machinery that had supposedly maneuvered into position. Small teams dragged sections of rubber tread across the soil, creating long, continuous lines of tracks that branched realistically, as if tanks had repositioned multiple times. They dragged weighted boards behind jeeps to replicate the churned-up ground that followed the movement of artillery tractors. These details were subtle, almost invisible to an untrained eye, but to German analysts, they were the fingerprints of authenticity. The Ghost Army knew this, and so they created not just objects, but context, because a tank without tracks was a lie. But a tank with tracks, positioned logically according to the terrain with supporting artillery placed exactly where doctrine demanded it, was a story the Germans would believe. To reinforce this, they added dozens of small but crucial touches: latrine pits dug at the correct distance from camp, tire ruts carved into dirt roads, simulated fuel dumps covered with tarps weighed down by fake jerry cans, and even mess hall set pieces, tables, benches, and extinguished fire pits, positioned as though men had recently eaten there. The Germans looked for signs of human presence, and so the Ghost Army created them in abundance. Footprints made with boot stamps dragged across the dirt, discarded ration props scattered strategically, laundry lines strung with uniform shirts and undershirts fluttering in the breeze, all of which contributed to the illusion of a busy, fully staffed encampment. But perhaps the most astonishing innovation lay in the tanks themselves. They were designed not only to look real, but to behave real under battlefield conditions. Soldiers were trained to tilt them, adjust them, reposition them in ways that simulated the weighty movement of actual armored vehicles. When German aircraft zoomed overhead, the Ghost Army could scramble to create new formations, shifting tank clusters just enough to suggest organic, tactical repositioning, a movement pattern the Germans would expect from divisions preparing for attack or defense. And when reconnaissance planes flew low, the inflatables remained still, unmoving as though weighed down by steel and fuel. If a strong breeze caused a tank to wobble, soldiers would brace its sides, using their own bodies to stabilize it, so that the Germans saw only what they were meant to see: strength, preparation, intent. Phantom artillery and inflatable armor worked in synergy with sound deception and false radio traffic, but even in isolation, the visual illusions were powerful enough to alter German strategic decisions. There were numerous instances when German commanders shifted real panzer divisions in response to these phantom armored battalions, burning fuel, losing time, and weakening frontline sectors where real Allied troops prepared to strike. Each movement of an inflatable tank rippled outward into real battlefield consequences. In one operation, a German probing unit shelled a position for hours, convinced that a major armored force lay concealed in a forest. The shells tore apart rubber and plywood, but the real divisions, miles away, advanced unimpeded because the Germans believed the threat lay where the Ghost Army wanted them to look. In another operation, German aerial reconnaissance reported the presence of over 30 Sherman tanks where only rubber shells stood. Believing a major attack was imminent, German commanders redeployed artillery and infantry units, thinning defenses in a nearby valley where the real U.S. forces would soon make their breakthrough. The illusion was so convincing that enemy scouts often failed to notice that the tanks did not spew exhaust, that no drivers clambered into them, that their tracks did not sink as deeply into soil as metal would, because the Ghost Army had crafted so many supporting details that any inconsistencies became drowned in the overwhelming realism of the scene. The inflatable tanks and phantom armor were not merely props, they were psychological weapons. They preyed on the fear of encirclement, the anxiety of misreading Allied movements, and the burden German commanders carried as they tried to predict where the next blow would fall. Every fake tank was a whisper in the enemy's ear, every phantom gun a suggestion of danger, every plywood barrel a reminder that nothing on the battlefield could be taken at face value. The Germans, already strained, already paranoid, began reacting to shadows more than substance. They hesitated, they second-guessed, they doubted everything. And doubt in war can be fatal. The Ghost Army understood this better than anyone. Their inflatable tanks and phantom armor were not merely tricks, they were battlefield ghosts, shaping the flow of combat without firing a single shot. And as their operations expanded across France, Luxembourg, Belgium, and Germany itself, these rubber giants would become one of the most influential illusions of the entire war, silent, air-filled juggernauts that turned the German war machine into a victim of its own expectations.
The art of sonic warfare became the Ghost Army's most astonishing and invisible weapon, a force capable of reshaping the battlefield not with physical mass, but with the illusion of mass, an auditory mirage designed to make the enemy hear what did not exist, fear what was not present, and react to divisions that were nothing more than orchestrated noise drifting across the countryside. Sound, unlike rubber tanks or plywood guns, could travel beyond the limits of terrain and sightlines, slipping through forests, echoing through valleys, and rolling across fields like an advancing storm. And because of this, it possessed the unique power to convince German forces that enormous troop movements were underway just beyond their lines, even when not a single real tank or transport vehicle stood nearby. As the Allies pressed deeper into Europe, German reconnaissance became increasingly dependent on sound to compensate for dwindling aircraft resources, poor weather, and the thick forests of the Ardennes and Hürtgen regions, where visibility was often obstructed. The Wehrmacht's forward observers, deprived of consistent aerial support, listened to the rumble of engines in the night, the clatter of treads, the shifting of gears, the shouted orders carried by wind, all of which allowed them to gauge the size of an advancing force long before they could see it. So the Ghost Army sought to corrupt this process entirely, to poison the well of enemy perception by turning the night itself into a vast theater of sound, where divisions could materialize out of darkness at will. To do this, they relied on massive 500-pound speakers mounted on half-tracks, capable of projecting audio at extraordinary distances, up to 15 miles in the right conditions. And each operation demanded meticulous acoustic planning that rivaled the precision of artillery barrages. Before deploying the speakers, sound engineers surveyed the terrain the way gunners surveyed for fire missions, calculating how sound would bounce off ridge lines, how forests would absorb certain frequencies, how valleys might amplify low rumbles, and how wind direction would carry or distort audio cues. These calculations were not academic. They were the difference between fooling the Germans into believing a tank battalion was forming on their flank and accidentally broadcasting engine noise in a direction that made no tactical sense. Every sonic deception followed a script, one meticulously crafted from recordings taken from real divisions weeks earlier. The clanging of tread plates, the grinding of transmissions switching gears, the chaotic hum of armor in motion, and the layered babble of drivers shouting to ground guides as vehicles maneuvered into staging positions. These were not simple sounds, they were engineered battle soundscapes, created by pioneers in audio technology, using massive wire recorders captured from Hollywood sound studios and adapted for war. The engineers spent hours cataloging and mixing tracks, splicing in the crescendos and rests that mirrored actual tactical behavior. The slow buildup of engines as tanks warmed up, the sudden roar of a convoy moving out, the sputtering idles of vehicles waiting for orders, the metallic shriek of brakes, and the deep, rhythmic thunder of artillery being positioned.
When these sounds were unleashed through the giant speakers, they blended into a masterful illusion of an army larger than anything the Ghost Army could visually simulate alone. In the dead of night, German scouts would hear an approaching roar, 1,000 tons of metal grinding forward, treads tearing into soil, engines roaring like beasts awakening, and their reports would describe entire armored regiments preparing for an assault, even if the Ghost Army had only inflated a few rubber tanks or sometimes nothing at all. Sonic illusions were used in conjunction with visual deception, but in many operations, sound alone created the illusion of mass so convincingly that the Germans reacted before ever confirming visually what their ears already believed. In one operation near the Moselle River, the Ghost Army used sound to project the movement of an entire armored division preparing to cross, broadcasting tanks rolling up to the riverbank, engineers unloading bridging equipment, artillery being wheeled into place. The Germans, hearing these unmistakable sounds echoing across the water at night, redeployed infantry and anti-tank guns to face an attack that never came, weakening another sector where the real Allied forces would assault at dawn. The Ghost Army understood a truth long known to musicians and acousticians, but never before applied to warfare at this scale. Humans believe their ears, even when their eyes cannot confirm what they hear. And in the darkness of night or the fog of early morning, sound becomes the dominant interpreter of reality. The Germans relied on this instinct, so the Ghost Army aimed to hijack it entirely. The engineers even manipulated environmental conditions, projecting sounds during hours when temperature inversions caused noise to travel farther, using fog to mask the origins of sound, aligning speakers toward reflective surfaces like stone walls, cliffs, or buildings that would scatter and amplify audio like a natural loudspeaker. They experimented with distance illusions, broadcasting low-frequency tank idols that seemed far away but massive, then slowly increasing volume to simulate an approaching formation, or alternating clusters of sounds to mimic several battalions maneuvering independently. The night became a symphony of deception, a battlefield where the enemy fought phantoms created by acoustics, responding to illusions with real troop movements, real artillery fire, real redeployment of exhausted men. But sonic warfare required more than just playing loud noises. It demanded the careful weaving of narrative through sound. The Ghost Army constructed auditory stories the Germans would believe. First the arrival of reconnaissance jeeps, then the rumbling of half-tracks delivering officers, then the buildup of tanks, then the whine of generators powering radio tents, followed by the clatter of men unpacking crates and slamming hatches. These sequences mattered because sound had to match what a real unit would do at each stage of preparation. If the engineers played tank noises without any preceding setup noises, it would sound suspicious. A real military camp had stages of life, rhythms that experienced German listeners understood subconsciously. So the Ghost Army replicated those rhythms with painful accuracy. They created zones of noise, layering sounds to make it seem as though activity was happening across many acres. Distant tanks warming up to the left, trucks rattling to the right, artillery being unlimbered somewhere deeper in the woods. The enemy would hear it all and imagine thousands of soldiers moving in coordinated preparation, even though only a handful of men stood near the speakers monitoring the equipment and adjusting volume levels. This mastery of battlefield sound created remarkable effects. In one operation near the German border, the Ghost Army simulated the arrival of the 2nd Armored Division at a location where the division itself was nowhere near. They played the sound of 60-ton Sherman tanks arriving on flatbed trailers, the metal-on-metal scraping noise of treads grinding down ramps, engines coughing to life, and the deep thuds of tank guns undergoing calibration. German scouts, hearing the unmistakable audio signature of heavy armor arriving, sent urgent reports up the command chain, resulting in the redeployment of German reserves and artillery that left other areas dangerously exposed.
In another operation, during the Battle of the Bulge, the Ghost Army used sound to mimic a major U.S. counterattack forming in a sector where only a few defensive units remained. The Germans, already paranoid due to the fog and chaos of the Ardennes winter, heard the thunderous roars of approaching armor and halted their own advance, believing they were about to be encircled by an overwhelming force. These moments demonstrated a crucial truth. Sound manipulation could freeze an enemy, forcing them to pause, hesitate, or shift their plans. Hesitation in war can be fatal. And sonic warfare didn't merely cause hesitation, it caused misallocation, panic, and strategic misjudgment. German units reported hearing convoys that didn't exist, artillery trains that were illusions, and columns of armor that were nothing but sound waves vibrating through the night air. Some German units even prepared nighttime ambushes against tank columns that were never there, exhausting themselves, wasting fuel, and losing the element of surprise. The psychological impact of hearing an armored division moving in the darkness cannot be overstated. It conjures images of encirclement, overwhelming force, and imminent attack. German infantrymen, listening in their trenches, often braced for battles that would never come. Nerves fraying, morale buckling under the strain of anticipating phantom assaults. The Ghost Army amplified this effect by combining sonic warfare with radio deception and visual deployments. If German signal interceptors overheard chatter consistent with a tank division, and German scouts then heard tank engines rumbling in the dark, and German pilots then photographed what appeared to be tanks arranged across a ridge, every element built upon the other, reinforcing the lie until it became an unshakable truth in the minds of enemy commanders. That was the genius of sonic warfare. It was not sound alone, but sound integrated perfectly into a tapestry of deception. And yet, despite the overwhelming power of their acoustic illusion, the Ghost Army operated in constant danger. One misstep, a speaker placed too close to a road, a sudden power failure during a broadcast, a German patrol stumbling onto the equipment at night could expose the deception. The men performed their broadcasts in near complete darkness, hidden behind camouflage, with artillery shells sometimes landing close enough that the vibrations shook their recording equipment. They had to be ready to dismantle everything at a moment's notice, because if the Germans discovered the truth, the Ghost Army would not be captured as ordinary soldiers. They were deceivers, manipulators, creators of illusions, and the Germans had historically shown little mercy toward those engaged in psychological warfare. Each broadcast was a high-risk operation, a performance where failure meant more than embarrassment. It meant annihilation. Yet the risk was worth the reward. And as the war neared its climax, the art of sonic deception reached its highest form. German commanders, desperate and overwhelmed, became increasingly reliant on auditory cues as their forces collapsed under logistical strain. The Ghost Army exploited this fully, turning the night into a chaotic battlefield of illusions that stretched German nerves to breaking point. In the final months of the war, entire German regiments maneuvered instinctively in reaction to sounds that were nothing more than engineered noise, layered across the darkness like a deadly soundtrack. Sonic warfare had transformed from an experimental tactic into a decisive strategic tool. The Ghost Army had mastered the battlefield's most intangible domain, the domain of fear, anticipation, and sensory perception. And with nothing but sound, they moved divisions, redirected artillery, halted advances, and manipulated the enemy's vision of the battlefield. To hear an army is to believe an army exists, and the Ghost Army ensured the Germans heard whatever the Allies needed them to hear.
Radio illusions formed the invisible nervous system of the Ghost Army's deceptions, a complex and delicate web of electromagnetic whispers woven into the airwaves with a precision that rivaled the most sophisticated German intelligence systems. Because in a war where movement, supply, and command relied heavily on radio traffic, the ability to manipulate what the enemy heard and thought was occurring across the front lines became as powerful as the movement of actual tanks or artillery. To understand how profound this capability was, one must recognize that the Germans were pioneers in signals intelligence and had developed an extensive system for intercepting Allied communications. They monitored frequency patterns, operator habits, message density, encoding quirks, and even the psychological fingerprints of the individuals sending the messages. Their intercept stations were manned by highly trained listeners who could identify a unit simply by hearing its radio operator's unique touch on the key, the rhythm of the tapping, or the subtle pauses in transmission. Every legitimate division had its own character on the radio, and the Germans knew these patterns intimately. This was why the Ghost Army's radio illusions had to be flawless, not just technically accurate, but psychologically authentic. A single slip, a repeated phrase out of place, a timing inconsistency, a call sign used incorrectly could unravel the entire deception and expose the phantom forces for the fictions they were. So the Ghost Army built a radio deception framework as intricate as a spider's web, where every artificial transmission reinforced the illusion of real divisions moving where none existed. The radio deception teams, known within the unit as the Signal Company Special, became masters of mimicry, studying the communication rhythms of the divisions they impersonated as musicians study cadence and tone. They analyzed spacing between transmissions, the lengths of bursts, the frequency shifting habits of certain operators, and even the emotional undertones of messages sent during stressful operations. With this knowledge, they designed entire schedules of fake communication that mirrored the daily life of a division. Morning reports, logistical requests, reconnaissance updates, perimeter checks, confirmation of orders, and the constant hum of operational chatter. Their transmissions were not random, they were carefully plotted narrative points in an elaborate performance meant to convince German intercept teams that a division was occupying a specific area, preparing for attack or defense, or engaging in routine maneuvers. In this way, radio illusions became the voice of the Ghost Army's phantom divisions, and the Germans listened to these voices with deadly seriousness. The process began with research, because the Ghost Army could not simply transmit on arbitrary frequencies. They needed to match precisely the frequencies used by the divisions they were impersonating. They studied old transmissions, intercepted Allied messages, and coordinated discreetly with higher command to ensure perfect alignment with ongoing operations. Once they established the correct frequencies and call signs, they built full communication nets, complete with commanders, subordinate unit leaders, reconnaissance teams, supply officers, and artillery coordinators, all played by a handful of radio operators hidden in camouflage tents or trucks, tapping out entire worlds of fiction with steady fingers on their keys. When impersonating a division, the Ghost Army created a radio fingerprint that reproduced the quirks of the real operators. Some divisions used rapid-fire bursts with clipped endings. Others used longer, measured transmissions. Some operators habitually repeated certain phrases. Others paused exactly 2 beats before sending acknowledgments. These nuances became essential parts of the illusion. The Germans, confident in their ability to discern isolated details of radio usage, never imagined that an entire U.S. division's radio identity could be forged so convincingly. But the Ghost Army did just that, turning their tents into echo chambers of phantom commands that spread into the ether and found their way into German intelligence logs, where they were interpreted as genuine signals of troop concentration. And the deception grew deeper still. Real divisions normally operated with multiple radio operators dispersed across several square miles. Thus, a single operator broadcasting from a single point would be suspicious. To solve this, the Ghost Army deployed mobile radio teams equipped with small transmitters inside jeeps. These vehicles drove back and forth along predetermined routes, slowly, constantly, and methodically, broadcasting messages while on the move, creating the illusion that dozens of separate radio operators were communicating across a large area. This technique fooled the Germans into believing that the radio signature of a real division was present, spread across the landscape with the exact pattern expected of a large unit.
Meanwhile, the Ghost Army's intelligence officers monitored German radio intercept patterns through Allied listening posts, watching carefully for indications that the deception was working. When German message traffic spiked in reaction to their broadcasts, it confirmed the illusion had taken hold. In some operations, German commanders reacted so strongly to radio illusions alone that they shifted entire regiments, redeployed artillery, or canceled planned movements because the fictional division they believed they had detected posed too great a threat. In one case, a German panzer division delayed its advance by 48 critical hours, believing that a U.S. armored division had reinforced a sector, when in truth, the sector was being held by only a few lightly equipped Ghost Army units, broadcasting sophisticated chains of fake messages from a handful of moving jeeps. The brilliance of this deception lay in its integration with sonic warfare and inflatable decoys. When the Germans intercepted radio chatter describing, for example, the arrival of Sherman tanks, then heard the thunder of tank engines broadcast from speakers, and then viewed reconnaissance photographs showing rows of tanks on the ground, no matter that those tanks were rubber, German intelligence concluded they were looking at real armor. Radio illusions were the binding force that made the entire deception coherent. Sound and visuals were powerful, but without radio chatter to reinforce them, the Germans could suspect a trap. With the chatter, however, the illusion became airtight. The Ghost Army did not simply create random chatter, they created meaning. They broadcast plausible operational conversations, such as reconnaissance updates describing imaginary German troop movements, supply officers reporting shortages that didn't exist, artillery units requesting fire missions that would never be executed, and division commanders sending coded reports about routes, objectives, or obstacles. Every message had purpose, contributing to a greater narrative designed to mislead German intelligence into drawing false conclusions about Allied intentions. These messages were logged by Allied intelligence to ensure internal consistency. Errors in timelines or message content could expose the deception. Thus, the Ghost Army crafted entire fictional operations that existed only in radio form. The Germans, hearing these transmissions in the correct frequencies, using the expected call signs, matching the known fingerprints of real divisions, and reinforced by visual and sonic cues, accepted them as truth. The effectiveness of these illusions reached astonishing levels. In one operation near the Rhine, the Ghost Army created a full radio net to mimic an armored division preparing for a river crossing. They broadcast urgent messages about engineering units setting up bridging equipment, requests for artillery support, and reports of enemy resistance on the far bank. German intercept units panicked. Within hours, they began shifting forces to counter the crossing. Meanwhile, the real Allied divisions crossed the Rhine miles away, overwhelming weakened German positions that had been stripped of reinforcements thanks to the Ghost Army's phantom broadcasts. Another operation involved misdirecting German attention away from a crucial gap in the line. The Ghost Army simulated a major buildup in the wrong sector through intense radio traffic, leading German commanders to order defensive preparations that drained resources from the actual point of attack. When the real U.S. forces launched their assault, they encountered unexpectedly light resistance. The radio illusions had done their job perfectly. But the Germans' reliance on radio intelligence meant that the Ghost Army had to be flawless. A single compromised transmission could unravel their entire operation. To prevent this, they avoided transmitting predictable patterns for too long. They rotated call signs, crafted new narrative sequences, and maintained strict operational discipline to ensure that their broadcasts were indistinguishable from those of real divisions. As the war pressed into Germany itself, German units became desperate and hyper-alert, making deception even more difficult but also more effective when achieved. German forces, short on manpower and fuel, relied heavily on intelligence to decide where to place what little strength remained. This desperate reliance amplified the Ghost Army's impact. Every false radio illusion caused outsized reactions, forcing German units to march pointlessly, burn fuel they could not afford to lose, or entrench defensively around threats that did not exist. Radio illusions thus became both sword and shield, in that they could force the Germans to react, and a shield in that they protected real Allied units by drawing attention away from them. When combined with sonic warfare and visual decoys, the Ghost Army achieved a level of deception so complete that German intelligence reports during late 1944 and 1945 are filled with references to divisions that never existed in the locations described. The Ghost Army had rewritten the German picture of the battlefield.
And in war, the picture the enemy sees is everything. Radio illusions allowed the Ghost Army to speak directly into the enemy's mind, creating worlds of fiction that the Germans accepted as truth. With nothing but keys, frequencies, and the artful crafting of false communication, the Ghost Army reshaped the flow of entire operations. Their radios did not fire bullets, but they moved divisions. They did not drop bombs, but they dictated where enemy fire would fall. They did not command real troops, but they commanded enemy fear. In the dark hours before dawn, when the air was thick with tension and the front lines were quiet, the Ghost Army whispered into the electromagnetic void, and the Germans listened, believed, and acted upon every fabricated word. Through radio illusions, the Ghost Army proved that in modern warfare, reality is not simply what exists on the ground. Reality is what the enemy believes exists. And the Ghost Army mastered the art of belief with a degree of precision that turned the battlefield itself into a stage, and the airwaves into the fabric of their illusion. Creating the illusion of mass, of entire divisions appearing, shifting, preparing, and disappearing across the European theater, became the central magic of the Ghost Army, the remarkable sleight of hand that allowed a mere 1,100 men to simulate the presence, movement, and readiness of more than 30,000 troops at a time. And this illusion depended on the seamless orchestration of multiple layers of deception. Visual illusions from inflatable tanks and artillery, acoustic bombardments from massive speakers broadcasting engines and troop movement, and radio nets transmitting the chatter of fictional commanders and battalion leaders. But above all, it required a mastery of military behavior itself, the rhythms and patterns that defined how real divisions lived, breathed, and moved. Because a division was not simply a cluster of tanks and soldiers scattered across a landscape. It was a living organism with a daily routine, with logistical needs, with procedural habits that German intelligence knew as well as the Allies did. And because of this, the Ghost Army had to replicate not just the appearance of mass, but the behavior of mass. A real division generated noise, radio traffic, fuel consumption, vehicular patterns, supply routes, movement cycles, and 1,000 tiny details. The Ghost Army had to craft all of this out of thin air. And they did so by approaching the battlefield as a stage, and themselves as the architects of a vast military theater production, where every detail mattered. The spacing between tents, the way tank tracks crisscrossed a muddy field, the number of tire ruts leading to a supply depot, the length of time mess tents remained active, even the degree to which laundry hung on lines swayed naturally or sat damp and heavy with imaginary rain. For German scouts and aerial photographers, all these details contributed to a cohesive picture of life. The Ghost Army understood that mass was not created through a single overwhelming spectacle. It was built through thousands of little truths woven into a larger lie. To create the illusion of a division, they began by meticulously studying the behavior of the division they were impersonating. They analyzed how it arranged its motor pools, how many jeeps and trucks formed each row, how much spacing lay between vehicles, where fuel dumps were positioned relative to headquarters tents. They studied doctrinal manuals not for combat tactics, but for camp layout, equipment placement, and the subtle, predictable ways large military units organize themselves. Armed with this knowledge, they could transform an empty field into what appeared to be a bustling military hub with astonishing accuracy. Inflatable tanks were arranged not randomly, but according to the patterns of real armored battalions. Sherman spaced at intervals dictated by doctrine, artillery placed at calculated distances behind them, command vehicles positioned in a central cluster.
When they created the illusion of infantry, they erected tent cities with perfect precision, ensuring that tents were aligned exactly as they would be in real formations, with company streets laid out in neat rows, supply areas established behind the main line, and mess tents positioned where smoke from cooking fires, simulated, sometimes with smoke pots, would logically drift away from sleeping quarters. The Germans, scanning from above, recognized these patterns instantly. They looked like life, like organization, like preparation for movement or battle. But the illusion of mass depended not only on static arrangement, but dynamic behavior. Real divisions were never still. They shifted positions, they conducted reconnaissance patrols, they built fortifications, they moved convoys down roads. So the Ghost Army simulated these movements with a combination of ingenuity and outright boldness. They employed jeeps towing long boards or chains to churn up dirt roads, creating the illusion of heavy truck traffic. They built fake fortifications out of wooden beams, making it appear as though engineers had reinforced the area. They positioned inflatable tanks in new locations every few hours, creating tracks in the soil to simulate movement. Some operations required them to give the impression of a division preparing to attack, so they created forward observation posts, dug fake foxholes, laid out maps on tables inside open tents, and left behind discarded ration cans in strategic quantities. Not too many, not too few, but exactly the number German intelligence expected to see from the number of troops supposedly present. In other operations, the illusion demanded the appearance of a division preparing to withdraw or shift locations. In these cases, the Ghost Army carefully deconstructed parts of the camp while leaving others intact: stray equipment, an abandoned tent, tire tracks pulling out toward roads. German observers interpreted these signs as evidence of a movement already underway. And because the Ghost Army always tied these actions to coordinated radio and sound deception, the Germans accepted them as part of a coherent narrative. Nothing ever existed in isolation. Every visual cue corresponded to an acoustic cue, which corresponded to a radio cue, which corresponded to the Germans' own expectations of what a division in that area should be doing. The illusion of mass also depended on misdirection, making the Germans believe they were seeing one thing while drawing their attention away from something else. When the Ghost Army needed to convince the enemy that Allied forces were amassing in one location, they made a spectacle of their presence: enormous inflatable tanks, sound trucks broadcasting engine noise, radio nets exploding with chatter about fuel shortages or reconnaissance reports. But when the objective was to cover the retreat or repositioning of real Allied forces, the Ghost Army did the opposite. They created ghostly traces of a division that appeared to be dwindling, moving, or disintegrating. One of their most complex illusions involved simulating the nighttime retreat of an entire armored division. To do this, they coordinated a meticulously timed sequence of audio cues that began with the low rumble of engines starting, slowly building to the roar of columns forming up, then fading into the distance toward the southeast while radio messages confirmed the movement. Simultaneously, inflatable tanks were quickly deflated and moved aside, leaving behind empty impressions in the soil. Fake headlights shone through tree lines to simulate vehicles driving away, and tire marks were pressed into soft earth at intervals matching the speed of a real convoy. When German scouts observed the area at dawn, they believed they saw a division that had fully relocated overnight. Meanwhile, the real division had moved in the opposite direction under the cover of the Ghost Army's phantom withdrawal. At times, the Ghost Army simulated the presence of two divisions at once, one forming for an attack, another preparing defenses, through a layered combination of decoys, sound, and radio traffic, convincing German intelligence that the American forces vastly outnumbered them in certain areas. This manipulation of perceived mass caused German commanders to misallocate troops on a scale that significantly shaped the Allied advance. For example, in the weeks after D-Day, the Ghost Army convinced the Germans that the U.S. 6th Armored Division was preparing to attack the Breton Peninsula. The Germans reacted by reinforcing the area and holding defensive positions there, even though no such attack was planned. This left the eastern flank weaker, allowing the real U.S. forces to breach German lines and accelerate their advance towards the heart of France. The Germans were forced into a chronic state of overreaction, constantly shifting units to counter threats that were nothing more than shadows. But the illusion of mass did more than cause tactical missteps. It eroded German morale. Frontline troops, hearing rumors of massive Allied buildups, seeing what looked like the early stages of enormous offensives, and intercepting radio messages about powerful divisions reinforcing the line, began to fear that they were perpetually outnumbered. In war, perception becomes reality, and the Ghost Army exploited this truth mercilessly. The most remarkable aspect of the Ghost Army's illusion of mass was how often it succeeded despite the presence of German skeptics. Some German officers suspected deception, but war conditions forced them to react to any possible threat. They could not afford to gamble and assume the divisions were fake. The Ghost Army created illusions with enough detail to tip the balance of uncertainty in their favor. And even when the Germans doubted what they saw, they could not risk ignoring it. In the end, the Germans often chose to defend phantom positions rather than risk catastrophe by assuming the illusions were false. This is what made the Ghost Army so effective. They did not simply create illusions, they created decisions. Their fabrications caused German commanders to move real troops, real armor, real artillery. They shaped the battlefield not through strength, but through manipulation, exploiting the enemy's fear of being outflanked or overwhelmed. They built entire armies out of air, and those phantom armies shaped the movement of real ones.
Coordinating the illusion required a level of synchronization so intricate, so multi-layered, that the Ghost Army became less a military unit and more a grand orchestral ensemble where every deception, visual, sonic, radio, and behavioral, functioned as its own instrument in a sprawling symphony designed to overwhelm German perception with carefully crafted falsehoods that were so convincing, so immersive, that even skeptical enemy commanders found themselves acting on the illusions as though they were undeniable truths, because deception, at its core, was not about showing the enemy something new, but about confirming what the enemy already suspected, reinforcing their expectations until they no longer distinguished between authentic intelligence and the Ghost Army's manufactured reality. The heart of this coordination lay in timing, because an inflatable tank appearing before radio chatter indicated an armored rival would break the illusion, and sound broadcasts of moving convoys must match the shifting arrangement of decoys on the ground, and tire tracks could not advance before the narrative transmitted through the radio net suggested movement. Every element had to support the others. This meticulous synchronization began long before the Ghost Army ever reached a designated location. High Command would identify a strategic requirement, perhaps to convince the Germans that an attack was coming from the north, when in reality, the real division planned a southern breakthrough, or to mask the withdrawal of a worn-down regiment, or to inflate Allied strength in a sector where defenses were dangerously thin. The Ghost Army's planners then received intelligence briefings that included not only the German troop dispositions and aerial reconnaissance patterns, but also the psychological profile of the German commanders facing them, because each enemy leader had his own tendencies, fears, and methods of interpreting intelligence, and the deception had to match those biases. Some German commanders reacted aggressively to perceived threats, rushing reinforcements to counter any hint of Allied armor. Others were cautious, requiring a buildup of evidence before believing a division was present. The Ghost Army crafted their illusions to exploit these tendencies. Aggressive commanders were bombarded with overwhelming displays of tanks and radio chatter in short bursts designed to trigger rapid responses, while cautious commanders were fed slow-building narratives, incremental increases in radio traffic, carefully spaced visual cues, and progressive sonic layers that suggested a gradual buildup of forces. This calibration of deception to the psychological profile of the enemy made the illusions far more effective. Once the planners established the deception strategy, the operation moved into its reconnaissance phase. Ghost Army officers ventured into the field to survey terrain, studying every contour, ridge, forest edge, and structure that could support or betray the illusion. They mapped out vantage points likely to be used by German observers, calculating how inflatables would appear from those angles, how shadows would fall depending on the time of day, and where sound would travel or dissipate. If the terrain lacked features for concealment or amplification, the Ghost Army would create them, digging shallow depressions to anchor inflatables against wind, building small berms to mask the bases of plywood artillery pieces, or arranging camouflage netting to distort telltale uniformity in decoy placement. Their terrain analysis was as meticulous as that of actual armored divisions preparing for battle, because the Ghost Army's very survival depended on convincing the enemy that their illusion was grounded in reality. Once terrain mapping was complete, the operation moved into its deployment phase. A choreographed sequence of actions executed with precision, often under moonlight or fog, when their movements would be least visible to German aerial reconnaissance. Trucks rolled into position. Men jumped out and began unrolling deflated tanks across the grass, like giant collapsed beasts waiting to breathe. Air compressors whined to life, filling the tanks until they rose into recognizable shapes. Teams hammered stakes into the ground to anchor inflatables against wind, while others painted fresh tire tracks into the soil or used rollers to create the impression of heavy tank movement. Simultaneously, the acoustic teams positioned their half-tracks, testing sound projection with brief muted bursts to gauge the terrain's acoustic response. The radio teams, often hidden in camouflage tents or inside trucks draped with netting, established their nets and prepared to broadcast the day's narrative. Each action had a timestamp, each deployment positioned exactly when and where it needed to be to build upon the evolving illusion. As dawn approached, the real performance began, and the Ghost Army transitioned from setup into operational deception, the moment when all layers began operating in concert, creating a living, breathing illusion of a full division's presence. Visual decoys stood ready in the positions where German reconnaissance expected to see them. Sonic broadcasts began at low levels, simulating the early morning preparations of a division mobilizing, engines idling, equipment being adjusted, shouted instructions drifting across the field. As the sun rose, the inflatables cast long shadows across the landscape, solidifying the illusion of mass. German pilots scanning from above would photograph rows of tanks, artillery, and camp structures, arranged in doctrinal patterns that matched the habits of U.S. armored or infantry divisions. These photographs, once processed and delivered to German intelligence officers, reinforced the narrative they would soon see appear in their intercepted radio traffic. Meanwhile, the radio team transmitted messages perfectly timed to the unfolding deception. If visual decoys suggested a division preparing to advance, radio chatter might include reconnaissance reports, logistical requests for fuel or ammunition, or coded references to upcoming objectives. If the sonic team was broadcasting sounds of vehicles moving into position, the radio traffic would include operators relaying movement orders. The Germans, intercepting these messages, would correlate them with the sounds heard by forward observers and the visual evidence from aerial photographs. Every element validated the others. This layering was the Ghost Army's greatest strength. No single deception stood alone. It was always reinforced, amplified, and authenticated by the others. German commanders rarely trusted a single intelligence source in isolation, but when 3 or 4 different sources pointed to the same conclusion, a division present here, preparing to attack, shifting positions, they accepted it as truth. In some operations, the Ghost Army faked not just the presence of an entire division, but its behavior over multiple days. For example, they would simulate a buildup by gradually increasing the number of inflatable tanks, adding more sound broadcasts, layering in more intense radio chatter, and adjusting the camp arrangement to suggest more troops arriving. When the deception required the opposite, a division withdrawing, they would slowly reduce visible decoys, deaden radio chatter, and broadcast sonic cues of engines fading into the distance. The illusion became dynamic, evolving exactly the way a real division moved, adjusted, and responded to battlefield conditions. The coordination extended even further. When the Ghost Army impersonated specific divisions, they also had to replicate the unique markings and emblems used by those divisions. Military police from the Ghost Army wore the patches of the units they were impersonating and drove jeeps marked with the same symbols, patrolling roads in full view of German spies and French civilians who might inadvertently report their presence to the Nazis. These MPs set up roadblocks, directed imaginary convoys, and enforced traffic patterns consistent with the behavior of a large division. Their presence on the roads reinforced the idea that thousands of troops were in motion, even though there might have only been a few dozen men behind the illusion. Every step of the way, the Ghost Army's actions were calculated to match the expectations of German intelligence. They created the illusion of supply lines by positioning rows of empty fuel drums along roadsides, or constructing fake supply depots covered by tarps. They simulated mess halls by arranging tables and extinguished cook fires. They dug latrine pits at distances that perfectly matched U.S. Army field manuals. German scouts observing such details recognized them instantly. They were the telltale signs of life, of a division living and operating in the field. And so, even when doubts crept in, the Germans could not dismiss the deception. The coordination also depended on speed. Real divisions moved quickly, adjusting positions based on tactical needs. The Ghost Army had to mimic this agility. In several operations, they set up an entire phantom encampment in the morning, let it stand long enough for German planes to photograph it, then dismantled it by afternoon and reassembled it miles away before nightfall. This gave the impression of rapid redeployment, suggesting the division was preparing for a major maneuver. German commanders reviewing aerial photos taken hours apart interpreted these movements as signs of strategic intent and reacted accordingly. This rapid transformation often exhausted the Ghost Army's personnel, yet they performed it repeatedly, knowing that their illusions protected real divisions from being targeted or outmaneuvered. Coordination was not merely tactical, it was psychological. The Ghost Army studied German fears and used them as tools. When the Germans feared being outflanked, the Ghost Army simulated flanking movements. When they feared armored breakthroughs, they created phantom tank divisions. When they feared infantry massing in forests, they filled the woods with tents, fires, and sonic echoes of men moving through the undergrowth. Every illusion exploited an enemy fear. And when fear shapes decision-making, deception becomes devastatingly effective.
The result of this layered coordination was profound confusion in German command structures. On multiple occasions, German intelligence reported the same division in two different places at once, one real, one a phantom created by the Ghost Army. German generals sent reconnaissance units scrambling, ordered divisions on forced marches, repositioned artillery, and redeployed reserves, sometimes leaving critical sectors dangerously underdefended. Entire battles shifted because the Germans fought shadows instead of substance, reinforcing positions that no Allied division intended to attack and abandoning those where real breakthroughs were planned. The coordination of illusions became an engine of misdirection that reshaped the war itself. To the Germans, the battlefield grew unpredictable. American divisions appeared and vanished, moved at impossible speeds, amassed in unexpected places, or withdrew suddenly with no trace. It felt as though the Allies possessed some supernatural advantage, some overwhelming logistical superiority that allowed them to position troops with ghost-like fluidity. But the truth was simpler. The Ghost Army had mastered the art of synchronizing deception so perfectly that fiction became indistinguishable from reality. Their illusions were not accidents or improvisations. They were deliberate, precise, and executed with a discipline that rivaled the most complex, real military maneuvers. Every inflatable tank, every broadcast, every radio transmission, every false insignia worn by a patrolling MP was part of a larger tapestry. And through this tapestry, the Ghost Army wove illusions that caused German commanders to doubt their senses, their intelligence reports, and sometimes even their understanding of the battlefield itself. They created not just the illusion of mass, but the illusion of omnipresence, of Allied forces appearing wherever needed, whenever needed, in whatever numbers the situation demanded. And in war, when the enemy believes you are everywhere, they have already lost control of the battlefield. That was the power of coordinated deception. That was the mastery of the Ghost Army.
The Ghost Army's first true tests in Normandy unfolded beneath the shadow of the most massive and consequential military undertaking of the war, the Allied invasion of Europe.
And in those chaotic weeks after D-Day, when the beaches were secured, but the hedgerows of Normandy became a suffocating labyrinth of ambushes, sniper fire, and hidden machine guns, the Ghost Army had to prove its worth not in theory, not in training scenarios, but in the brutal, shifting reality of frontline operations where every misstep could bring catastrophe and every successful illusion could save hundreds, even thousands of Allied lives. The landings on June 6th had opened the door into France, but the Germans, far from broken, regrouped with terrifying speed. The countryside of Normandy, with its tangled bocage, those thick earthen embankments topped with dense hedges, became a natural fortress for German defenders, forcing the Allies to fight for every meter. German reinforcements poured in from across France, and their commanders, skilled in defensive warfare, arranged armored units and artillery batteries in concealed positions, waiting to strike at weak points in the Allied line. German reconnaissance aircraft flew patrols daily, seeking signs of Allied buildups, searching for gaps, reading the terrain with predatory instinct. It was into this desperate and volatile environment that the Ghost Army stepped for the first time, given missions that would determine whether deception could be a decisive battlefield tool or whether it would crumble under enemy scrutiny. Their earliest deployments were modest in scale compared to the later operations that would span entire regions, but even these initial experiments demanded absolute precision. One of their first assignments was to cover a dangerously exposed flank near the city of Carentan, where the Germans were probing aggressively, seeking to exploit weaknesses in the newly formed Allied foothold. The U.S. commanders needed time to bring in armored reinforcements, and during this precarious interval, the Ghost Army was ordered to create the illusion that armored units had already arrived. They moved into the designated sector under cover of night, their trucks slipping along narrow Norman lanes shadowed by tall hedgerows, the air thick with the smell of manure, damp earth, and the lingering smoke of destroyed farmhouses. The men worked in silence, knowing that German patrols were close enough that a raised voice might carry. They unrolled inflatable Sherman tanks, their rubber skins slick with morning dew, and inflated them in fields where German aerial scouts expected to see armor preparing for a counterattack. But the terrain of Normandy presented a new challenge no prior training had fully prepared them for: the bocage. The hedgerows restricted movement, disrupted clean lines of sight, and created pockets of visibility that shifted depending on the observer's position. This meant the inflatables had to be positioned with extraordinary care, so that their shapes could be glimpsed through breaks in vegetation at just the right angles, forming convincing silhouettes without revealing any flaws in their construction. The Ghost Army adapted quickly, using gaps in hedgerows to frame their illusions, placing the fake tanks where they would be partially obscured, enough to be convincing, not enough to betray their true nature. Meanwhile, the sonic team established their equipment along wooded lanes and projected the deep guttural rumble of tank engines, while engineers broadcast the metallic clatter of tools and the shouted commands of imaginary crews preparing for movement. These sounds rolled across the hedgerows, echoing strangely among the earthen barriers, creating a disorienting auditory scene that German scouts struggled to decode. The radio deception team matched these illusions with carefully crafted transmissions suggesting that the 6th Armored Division was occupying the area, despite the fact that the real armored units were miles away, still navigating the bottlenecked supply routes leading inland from the beaches. German intercept units noted the sudden appearance of this division and adjusted their assessments accordingly. And so the Ghost Army's first real deception took hold. German commanders probing the sector became cautious, hesitating to press their attack against a position that now appeared heavily reinforced. Their reconnaissance aircraft, though limited by Allied air superiority, confirmed the presence of armored silhouettes. Their intercept units recorded division-level communication. Their forward observers recorded the unmistakable sound of heavy engines in the bocage. This was enough to shift their momentum, to stop them from exploiting a vulnerability that might have allowed them to drive a wedge between the landing zones. The Allies were able to bring in reinforcements unmolested, and the line held. This early success emboldened the command, and the Ghost Army was soon tasked with more ambitious deceptions.
One of their next major missions involved protecting the Allied right flank during the buildup towards Saint-Lô, a key strategic city whose capture would open the route to the breakout into France. German forces massed heavily around this area, and the Allies needed to mask the movement of their armored units preparing for Operation Cobra, the massive offensive that would finally breach the German defensive lines in Normandy. The Ghost Army was ordered to simulate the presence of a large armored force to the east of the planned breakout, thereby pulling German troops and artillery away from the real point of attack. In this operation, they employed every tool at their disposal. Dozens of inflatable tanks were arranged in rolling lines across farmlands and meadows. Fake artillery batteries were positioned behind hedgerows, supported by carefully painted blast marks on the soil. Sound teams created a deafening environment of tank engines powering up, trucks maneuvering into position, and supply convoys arriving over gravel roads. Radio operators broadcast a full narrative of the fictional division preparing for a major push, reports of reconnaissance patrols, logistics updates, and even the grievances of commanders frustrated with supply delays. German aerial reconnaissance, though hampered by cloud cover and Allied fighters, managed to capture glimpses of these phantom forces. In combination with the radio traffic intercepted, the Germans became convinced that a major assault was imminent from this sector. They repositioned artillery, redeployed infantry, and shifted armored units to defend the area. This redistribution of forces weakened the German defense opposite the real breakout zone near Saint-Lô, a weakening that allowed Operation Cobra to explode across the front with extraordinary force, breaking through the German defensive lines in Normandy and launching the Allied advance that would liberate most of France in a matter of weeks. The Ghost Army's contribution was invisible in the official reports, but unmistakable in the battlefield outcomes. Their illusions had saved countless lives by diverting enemy firepower away from the actual point of assault. But Normandy also tested the Ghost Army in ways that exposed their vulnerabilities. The bocage, while useful for concealment, meant German patrols could approach dangerously close without being detected. On more than one occasion, the Ghost Army members found themselves only yards away from German scouts who were attempting to gather intelligence. Had any patrol stumbled upon an inflatable tank and realized it was nothing more than air and rubber, the deception would have collapsed instantly. One night, during a tense moment in late June, a German artillery barrage struck near one of the Ghost Army's sonic trucks, exploding close enough to rattle the equipment and throw dust into the air. The men held their breath in the darkness, hoping the Germans were merely firing blind. If a patrol followed up the barrage, if they chose to probe the area, the entire operation could have been compromised. But the Germans, deceived by the illusion of a far larger force, hesitated to advance. They fired their shells and withdrew. The Ghost Army repaired the damaged equipment and resumed their broadcast before dawn. Such moments revealed the razor's edge they operated upon. Normandy also forced the Ghost Army to refine their techniques. German observers had learned through years of warfare to scrutinize unusual behavior. In one early deception attempt, a German analyst noticed that a cluster of tents showed no signs of smoke from cook fires at dusk, a minor detail but enough to suggest something was off. From that moment forward, the Ghost Army never again erected a tent without preparing its surroundings to mimic the subtle rhythms of life: extinguished fire pits, scattered ration tins, paths marked by footprints. Normandy sharpened the Ghost Army's instincts, turning them from experimental deceivers to masters of illusion. They realized that every deception had to feel lived in. Every illusion had to breathe with the realism of a division truly occupying the land. And as the Allies pushed through the hedgerows and into open terrain, the Ghost Army stood ready to deliver even bolder illusions on a scale Normandy could not contain. Their first tests had proven that their methods worked, that inflatable tanks could change the course of battles, that sonic illusions could freeze enemy advances, and that radio deception could manipulate German intelligence assessments, and that the careful layering of these techniques could alter the flow of operations. Normandy was the crucible that refined the Ghost Army's craft. It was the proving ground where their theories became battlefield truth, And from the hedgerows of France, they would carry this sharpened craft into even greater deceptions, ones that would shake German command structures, draw entire divisions astray, and pave the way for the Allied advance toward the heart of Europe. In Normandy, the ghosts had been born. In the battles to come, they would become legendary.
Operation Breast Pocket became one of the Ghost Army's quietest, cleanest, and most technically perfect illusions. The kind of deception that did not rely on massive displays of inflatable armor or the thunder of artificial convoys rolling across the night, but instead on subtlety, timing, and psychological manipulation crafted with extraordinary finesse. It unfolded in the weeks following the bloody hedgerow fighting in Normandy, when Allied forces were clawing their way through France, stretching supply lines thin and pressing German forces back with relentless pressure, but always confronting the danger that a single weakly defended sector, a single exposed flank, could snap under the weight of a sudden German counterattack. This was the environment in which Breast Pocket took shape, not a battle defined by explosive clashes, but one defined by shadows, expectations, and the thin line between perceived strength and actual vulnerability. The operation's purpose was straightforward yet urgent: to shield a dangerously exposed area in the American line near the town of Brest, where German forces still held strong positions around the port and possessed the ability to launch sudden thrusts that could disrupt Allied advances, damage logistical routes, and threaten the fragile momentum of the broader campaign. The Americans needed time. Time to reorganize, time to reposition real units, time to bring up reinforcements. And to buy that time, the Ghost Army would create the illusion of an entire division settling into the sector, ready for defensive operations. The challenge lay not simply in simulating presence, but in simulating lack of movement. The Ghost Army's earlier missions in Normandy had focused on portraying divisions preparing for attack or redeployment, noisy illusions filled with engine roars, radio chatter, and visible buildup. Breast Pocket, however, demanded silence, stability, and the slow, deliberate signs of a division digging in for defense. The enemy needed to believe that the Americans had fortified the area, not with tanks roaring across fields, but with infantry entrenching, artillery calibrating, and units settling into well-established positions. German reconnaissance in the region was unpredictable. Their aircraft flew sporadically due to losses and fuel shortages, but when they did appear, they flew low and methodically, photographing every patch of terrain that might hide Allied strength. Their ground patrols were equally persistent, probing for weaknesses, testing American reactions, and listening closely at night for any signs of movement. The Ghost Army had to craft a deception so quiet and so steady that the Germans would sense only one thing: there is no opportunity here. They moved into position at dusk, their trucks creeping along narrow roads carved through rolling French farmland that was still littered with wreckage from earlier engagements. The fading light softened everything: trees, ridges, abandoned buildings, making it easier for the unit to slip unnoticed into the designated area. But the lack of darkness made the early deployment particularly delicate. Men unrolled tents quickly, spread them across fields in carefully regimented lines that matched the camp layout of the division they were impersonating. Every tent was positioned according to doctrine, spaced at precise intervals, with the correct orientation relative to prevailing wind patterns as described in Allied field manuals, a detail often overlooked by novices, but one the Ghost Army had come to master through hard-won experience. As night settled, they began adding the subtle signs of life: extinguished fire pits dug at strategic locations, footprints pressed into soft soil with tools shaped to mimic the soles of standard-issue boots, and scattered ration tins placed at a frequency consistent with a full regiment of men. They deployed a small number of dummy artillery pieces, not many, because the illusion did not call for a significant artillery presence, but just enough to suggest that the division had defensive firepower ready. These artillery props were placed behind natural cover, hedgerows, tree lines, shallow rises in the terrain, where German reconnaissance would glimpse only their silhouettes through gaps in foliage. It was a delicate balance: too visible, and the deception risked being scrutinized; too hidden, and German analysts might dismiss the sector as lightly defended.
To simulate infantry presence, they erected carefully positioned washing lines strung with uniform shirts and blankets, placed field telephones near open tent flaps, and even installed fake observation posts on ridges overlooking approaches where German patrols might appear. They avoided showing too much activity. Defensive positions did not bustle like staging grounds for attacks. Instead, they conveyed a sense of calm readiness, of men settled into routines. That was the brilliance of Breast Pocket. It was not about overwhelming the enemy with spectacle, it was about convincing them with ordinariness. But the quiet made the deception harder to maintain, because sound was now their enemy. Any artificial broadcast of engines or heavy equipment would contradict the illusion of a division merely holding ground. Instead, the sonic team created a delicate tapestry of restrained noise, the soft murmur of distant conversation, the occasional clatter of a mess kit, the faint scrape of tools against dirt as imaginary infantry dug foxholes or reinforced their positions. These subtle audio cues projected at low volumes across short distances created an astonishingly authentic impression of a living defensive encampment. German patrols advancing cautiously toward the American lines at night heard exactly what they expected to hear. Not the chaos of armor, but the sporadic, rhythmic sounds of troops resting, working, and maintaining their defenses. Meanwhile, the radio deception team built a communication profile appropriate for a defensive posture. Instead of the frantic, urgent chatter associated with offensive operations, the fake division transmitted routine perimeter check-ins, quiet logistical updates, requests for ammunition inventories, and reports from imaginary observation posts describing German movements. There were long gaps between transmissions, just like there would be with a unit simply holding the line. German intercept units detected nothing unusual, nothing that suggested weakness or opportunity. And that was exactly the point. As the operation continued, German reconnaissance aircraft flew missions that captured photographs of the Ghost Army's dummy positions. Analysts reviewing the images noted the presence of tents, supply dumps, and artillery. They saw the guiding patterns of tracks and paths in the soil. They observed no major troop movements that would indicate the division was spread thin or preparing to withdraw. Everything looked stable. Everything looked secure. Everything looked normal. And so the Germans concluded, the sector is defended. Attacking here is unwise. Their ground patrols confirmed similar observations. The faint sounds of activity in the American lines suggested alertness, not exhaustion. They avoided probing aggressively, worried that a stronger American force hid behind the hedgerows. And thus, through silence and subtlety, the Ghost Army achieved its goal. They created not only the illusion of strength, but the illusion of uninterest, a passive, steady presence that discouraged German aggression more effectively than loud displays of force ever could. The true brilliance of Operation Breast Pocket lay in its minimalism. It demonstrated that deception was not always about overwhelming the enemy with dazzling illusions of armor or noise, but sometimes about crafting a quiet narrative of stability that matched enemy expectations so perfectly that German commanders felt no urgency to test it. They accepted the illusion because it was entirely plausible. The operation unfolded almost invisibly to the rest of the Allied forces. No newspapers covered it, no generals wrote about it in glowing reports. It left behind no great scenes of destruction or triumph. But in its quiet success, it protected a vulnerable sector for days, days that allowed real divisions to maneuver into position for the next phase of the campaign. In the grand history of the war, Breast Pocket was a whisper between thunderclaps. A shadow operation that left no dramatic footprint but changed outcomes nonetheless. It proved that the Ghost Army could defend as effectively with illusions as other divisions defended with bullets. It proved that subtlety could be as powerful as spectacle. And it set the stage for the larger, bolder deceptions still to come. Deceptions that would not only protect Allied troops, but fundamentally mislead entire German armies. Operation Breast Pocket was a masterpiece of restraint,
a silent triumph forged in the hedgerows of France, where the ghosts learned that sometimes the most convincing illusions are the ones that make the enemy believe nothing unusual is happening at all.
Operation Koblenz marked one of the Ghost Army's most daring and technically demanding illusions, a deception staged along the banks of the Moselle River, where the rugged slopes, wooded ridges, and valleys carved by centuries of flowing water combined to create a natural amphitheater capable of magnifying sound, distorting shadows, and carrying whispers miles across the night. It was in this treacherous landscape, filled with German artillery observers perched on high ground, panzer reconnaissance units probing the riverfront, and river crossings that could become death traps, that the Ghost Army was tasked with accomplishing what seemed impossible, convincing the Germans that a major American armored division was preparing to cross the Moselle in force, even though in reality, the Allies had no intention of making that crossing at that moment. The stakes were high, because the German First Army, though battered and retreating, was still capable of mounting powerful counterattacks if they identified a weak point or misread American intentions. A river crossing was one of the most dangerous operations an army could attempt, and the mere suggestion of one could electrify German command and force them to reposition divisions to counter the threat. The Ghost Army's mission, therefore, was not to simulate defense, nor to stage a gradual buildup, but to create the unmistakable impression of an imminent, large-scale assault across the Moselle. A bold illusion that required a multi-layered orchestration of tank soundscapes, engineering noises, radio transmissions, construction of fake bridging equipment, movement of phantom artillery, and visual decoys arranged with surgical precision along the riverbank. They arrived under the cloak of night, moving through a series of narrow roads cut into steep hillsides, their trucks humming low as they descended toward the river's edge. The Moselle lay before them, a wide, slow-moving ribbon of dark water glistening faintly under the moonlight. The opposite bank, shrouded in fog and shadow, was alive with German listening posts, patrols, and artillery spotters who scanned the water every night, expecting the Americans to attempt a crossing somewhere along its length. The Ghost Army's arrival had to be invisible. Any sign of unusual activity before the illusion was ready could compromise the entire operation. Working quietly, they began the careful positioning of inflatable tanks in recessed clearings near the water's edge, arranging them in the staggered formations that armored divisions used when preparing to cross a river. They placed fake command vehicles in elevated positions overlooking the crossing sites. They erected tents along the riverbank, simulating engineering units preparing calculations for pontoon bridges. They positioned dummy artillery batteries on nearby hills, their barrels pointed toward the German-held far bank. These props were placed not for close inspection, the Germans would never get near enough to scrutinize them, but for the aerial reconnaissance photographs that would inevitably be taken at dawn. Every visual cue had to be consistent with the narrative the Ghost Army intended the Germans to perceive. At the same time, the acoustic team surveyed the river, testing how sound traveled across the water. The Moselle Valley, with its steep slopes and curved riverbanks, behaved like a vast acoustic chamber, amplifying low-frequency sound and sending it rolling for miles. This worked in the Ghost Army's favor. If they could calibrate their audio broadcasts correctly, they could simulate massive troop movements and engineering preparations with far greater efficiency than usual. As the night deepened, they began their sonic illusion. Low rumbles echoed up the valley, the unmistakable throb of tank engines idling as if waiting for orders. Then came the grinding sounds of heavy armor being maneuvered into position, metal scraping, gears shifting, commands shouted by imaginary engineering crews coordinating the placement of bridging equipment. They broadcast the clatter of pontoon sections being unloaded from trucks, the metallic rings of tools striking steel, the grunting of men hauling heavy ramps toward the shore. These sounds, layered carefully, created a soundscape so vivid and so convincingly chaotic that German scouts on the far bank, listening through the fog and darkness, reported significant engineering activity preparing for a crossing. The Germans had long feared an American assault across the Moselle, and had prepared defenses accordingly. They were alert, ears tuned to any hint of movement. The Ghost Army used that alertness against them. The radio deception team matched the Solek narrative with meticulous precision. They transmitted coded messages between imaginary battalions, infantry commanders, and engineers. Reports of engineers facing delays unloading pontoons, request artillery cover during crossing, and panzer forces detected across the river filtered through the airwaves at carefully timed intervals. The transmissions were crafted to create friction, tension, and urgency, the hallmarks of a real river crossing operation where every detail must be coordinated perfectly. The Germans intercepted these messages and pieced together an intelligence picture that matched the sounds coming across the river. Their analysts reported to divisional headquarters that the Americans were preparing to cross near Koblenz. They urged a redeployment of artillery and infantry to reinforce the threatened sector. Meanwhile, aerial reconnaissance at dawn captured images of the Ghost Army's carefully arranged decoys. Rows of tanks poised behind tree lines, dummy artillery silhouetted against the rising sun, tents scattered along the riverbank, and stacks of fabricated bridging equipment covered by tarps that billowed in the breeze. These images, combined with radio chatter and sonic cues, formed a compelling narrative. To the Germans, everything pointed to a single conclusion: the Americans were ready to force a crossing. The psychological effect on the German command was immediate. Fear of a river crossing is elemental. It presses on every instinct a commander possesses. Defensive positions on the far bank might be strong, but if the Americans secured even a small foothold, they could establish a bridgehead that might split German lines and unravel their defensive network. The Germans reacted with predictable urgency. Reports flowed through their command structure, recommending that reinforcements be sent to Koblenz. Artillery units were ordered to reposition to cover potential crossing sites. Infantry regiments marched through the night to strengthen the riverfront. Panzer units, already stretched thin, were redirected from sectors where their presence was desperately needed. The Ghost Army had successfully manipulated German strategic priorities. But the operation demanded sustainment. A river crossing is not a one-night affair. It unfolds over several days as engineers assemble bridges, armor moves into position, and commanders coordinate fire support. The Ghost Army had to match this rhythm to keep the illusion alive. They adjusted their soundscapes accordingly. During the second night, they broadcast the noises of men assembling pontoon sections, hammering stakes, and swinging tools in rapid succession. They added the dull thud of artillery calibration, the grinding whine of generators powering imaginary spotlight systems, and the intermittent bursts of tank engines repositioning to cover crossing points. They simulated the arrival of additional units by broadcasting convoys approaching through wooded roads. The illusion grew richer, deeper. German scouts reported increased activity. Their intercept units detected heavier radio traffic. Their commanders grew convinced that the crossing was imminent. Then, at the peak of tension, the Ghost Army executed its sharpest twist. Without warning, they began simulating setbacks. Sound broadcasts included shouts of frustration, the metallic crash of dropped equipment, and the echo of a pontoon section accidentally falling into the water. Radio traffic confirmed delays, flooding conditions worsening, equipment malfunction, request artillery suppression fire to resume construction. The fog thickened along the river. German observers watched from across the water, expecting the Americans to push through the setbacks and launch their crossing. But they did not. As dawn approached, the Ghost Army began to pack up. Quietly. Efficiently. By the time the sun crested over the hills, the inflatable tanks were gone. The noise had ceased. The radio nets were silent. A few ghostly impressions remained in the soil. The fading shadow of tank tracks, the outline of a camp, remnants that any withdrawing force would leave behind. German patrols on the far bank noted the sudden reduction in activity, but interpreted it as strategic repositioning following difficulties at the crossing site. They had no idea the Americans had never been there in any meaningful strength. Meanwhile, miles away, the real Allied forces executed movements unimpeded, taking advantage of the German redeployments sparked by the Ghost Army's illusion. Operation Koblenz had been more than confused local reconnaissance. It had successfully manipulated German operational strategy. A phantom crossing, created entirely by illusion, had pulled German manpower away from sectors the Americans intended to strike. The river remained uncrossed. No American division had risked lives fighting its way across the Moselle. Yet, German reports continued for days afterwards, documenting the threat of an American buildup near Koblenz. Even after the Ghost Army vanished like mist, their illusion lingered in the minds of the enemy. That was the true power of Operation Koblenz, not merely the flawless execution of coordinated deception, but the creation of a narrative so compelling, so believable, that it dictated enemy behavior even after the ghosts were gone.
When the Americans finally crossed the Moselle weeks later, they did so under far more favorable conditions, aided by the disarray and misallocation the Ghost Army had engineered. Koblenz was not the largest deception the Ghost Army would perform, nor the most famous, but it represented a turning point, a demonstration that deception could shape the battlefield at an operational level, not just tactical. It proved that illusions could command the movements of enemy divisions. It proved that air, sound, rubber, and radio waves could reshape the map as effectively as steel and blood. And it solidified the Ghost Army's role as one of the most indispensable, if least visible, instruments of the Allied advance through Europe. The feint at Metz became one of the Ghost Army's most audacious and complex large-scale misdirections, a deception crafted to manipulate the battlefield around one of Germany's most fortified cities in France, a place bristling with ancient forts, concrete bunkers, interlocking fields of fire, and deep defensive lines carved into the landscape. A city the Germans intended to hold at any cost, knowing that the fall of Metz would open the gateway to the Saar industrial region and threaten the heart of their homeland. As the U.S. Third Army under General Patton approached the city in late 1944, the Germans poured elite units, including formidable Panther tanks, into defensive positions surrounding Metz, especially along the northern and central sectors where they believed the Americans were most likely to strike. But Patton wanted something else entirely. He wanted to deceive the Germans into reinforcing the wrong sectors, stretching their defenses thin, and creating vulnerable flanks where real breakthroughs could be achieved. To carry out this bold manipulation, the Ghost Army was ordered to stage a massive multi-day illusion that would convince German commanders that an entire U.S. infantry division, later augmented by the illusion of an armored division, was preparing to launch a full-scale assault from the south and southeast of Metz, far from where Patton intended to strike. The magnitude of this operation required every deception discipline the Ghost Army possessed: visual, sonic, radio, logistical, behavioral, blended into one cohesive performance that would unfold across miles of contested terrain. They moved into position under skies thick with November clouds, the air heavy with the scent of wet leaves and smoke drifting from ruined villages. Rain had turned the earth near Metz into a thick, sucking mud that clung to boots and tires alike, slowing movement and amplifying danger. German artillery scouts watched the terrain constantly, scanning for any hint of American buildups. German patrols moved silently through a patchwork of forests and shattered farmhouses, looking for weaknesses in Allied lines. Every step the Ghost Army took risked detection. Their first task was to create the illusion of mass, not only tanks and guns, but the infrastructure of a large division preparing for a major assault. They began by deploying inflatable artillery batteries along the southern approaches, placing them behind natural rises and trenches dug earlier by real American units. These rubber howitzers, arranged in doctrinal spacing, looked formidable through binoculars and aerial cameras. Nearby fields filled with inflatable Sherman tanks, their silhouettes rising under the ghostly gray dawn as air compressors hummed quietly behind hedgerows. The inflatables were anchored with precision, their barrels angled toward Metz as though ready to join the coming bombardment. But static visuals alone could not create the illusion of imminent attack. They had to animate these phantoms. The Sonic Deception Company brought forward its giant speakers and began testing the acoustics of the hills around Metz, discovering quickly that the sweeping ridgelines and stone structures near old French forts created extraordinary natural echo chambers. Sounds bounced unpredictably, magnifying at some angles, vanishing at others. The team adapted, shifting speakers into precise orientations so the Germans would hear exactly what they needed to hear. The heavy rumble of tank engines maneuvering for attack positions, the grinding of gears, the clatter of artillery crews pulling ammunition crates into place, the rhythmic thud of sledgehammers striking earth as engineers built imaginary gun emplacements. These sounds, broadcast through the night, rolled like thunder through the mist and fog, convincing German observers that American forces were massing in vast numbers. Meanwhile, the radio deception unit constructed an entire narrative of movement, tension, and preparation. They filled Allied radio frequencies with a carefully orchestrated symphony of chatter, regimental commanders discussing objectives, battalion leaders confirming positions, engineers reporting on fortification progress, even supply officers complaining about shortages of mortar rounds, a detail the Germans eagerly seized upon, believing it indicated a real unit preparing for heavy fighting. German intercept stations documented these signals relentlessly, confident in their ability to distinguish fiction from fact. But the Ghost Army's transmissions were flawless. They mimicked not only the style, but the personality of the divisions they impersonated, copying communication rhythms, spacing, and operator quirks learned through days of study. The Germans believed what they heard, and that belief shaped decisions. Over the next 48 hours, the Ghost Army's illusion intensified. They simulated nighttime armor arrivals, broadcasting the roar of tank engines echoing across the hills, as inflatable tanks were repositioned to new staging areas. They created the impression of artillery arriving behind the front line by dragging weighted rollers over dirt roads to produce convincing tread patterns. They staged decoy supply depots, stacking fake crates and barrels under netting where observers would expect them. Military police from the Ghost Army, wearing the patches of the division they were impersonating, set up roadblocks along visible roads, directing imaginary traffic and showing themselves deliberately to French civilians who might pass information to German patrols. The Ghost Army had learned by now that the enemy often confirmed American movements through civilian reports, so they made sure that their soldiers, wearing the right insignia, were seen at crossroads, bridges, and village outskirts. Not too often, not too rarely, just enough to be credible. The Germans noticed. They began shifting their elite units accordingly. German reports indicated suspicious buildup near the southeastern approaches. Panther tanks, feared for their devastating firepower and thick frontal armor, were ordered to reposition to face the perceived threat. Artillery units shifted their barrels. Infantry formations moved into trenches near villages they believed the Americans intended to assault. Every German movement weakened other sectors of the defense, and that was exactly Patton's goal. Operation Metz was not merely about creating the illusion of strength, it was about redistributing the enemy's strength. While the Ghost Army performed their illusion to the south, the real American divisions prepared to strike the far better opportunity to the north and west, where German lines were now thinner, stretched by the deceptive threat the Ghost Army had engineered. As the days passed, the Ghost Army refined their illusion. They adjusted decoy placements daily to mimic the fluid nature of American assault planning. They introduced new sound recordings to simulate the arrival of fresh artillery units. They increased radio traffic intensity during periods when a real division would be rehearsing final plans for assault. German reconnaissance planes, flying cautiously due to Allied air dominance, captured grainy photographs through clouds and rain that looked like a steadily growing American buildup. The Germans were convinced, But perhaps the most dramatic moment came on the third night of the operation. The Ghost Army staged a simulated night assault rehearsal, using sound as the main weapon. The sonic trucks broadcast the deafening roar of dozens of tanks revving simultaneously, followed by the piercing shrieks of shells being loaded, the booming echoes of imaginary artillery firing preparation rounds, and the shouted countdowns of officers directing their men forward. The Germans, hearing this terrifying symphony through the fog and darkness, believed the Americans would attack at dawn. They prepared for a massive assault, reinforcing their southeastern lines with everything they had. Dawn arrived. Fog rolled across the landscape. The Germans stared into the mist, waiting. Nothing happened. Noon arrived. Still nothing. The Germans grew nervous. They knew the Americans were unpredictable, but such a sudden halt suggested either indecision or delay. Radio intercepts continued to deliver snippets of activity, but no attack came. Then, slowly, without fanfare, the sounds on the American side began to quiet. A few trucks departed. The inflatable tanks were dismantled under cover of night. The radio nets gradually went silent. A day later, the sector looked strangely calm. The Germans interpreted this as a pause, not a withdrawal, and so they held their positions for another day, and another, and another. By the time German intelligence realized that no attack was coming from the south, Patton's real assault had already begun from the north and west, exploiting the weakened lines and forcing German defenders into a disastrous retreat across multiple fronts. The feint at Metz had worked perfectly. The Panther tanks had been misdirected. German artillery had been wasted covering phantom targets. German reinforcements had marched needlessly into positions where no threat existed. A small unit of illusionists, engineers, artists, sound technicians, and radio magicians had outmaneuvered entire German divisions. But the operation's success came with tremendous risk. The Ghost Army was often within artillery range, and during one tense episode, a German scouting unit probed dangerously close to their positions, coming within a few hundred meters of the inflatable tanks. Had the patrol discovered the truth, the operation would have collapsed and the Ghost Army would have been annihilated. Yet they held their silence, they maintained discipline, and the Germans, deceived by the noise, the visuals, the radio traffic, and above all, their own expectations, withdrew before they ever saw the illusions for what they were. Operation Metz became one of the clearest examples of the Ghost Army's ability to influence not just tactical maneuvers, but strategic decisions across entire fronts. It demonstrated that deception was not merely an accessory to warfare, it was warfare. And through this deception, the Ghost Army helped accelerate the collapse of German defenses around one of the most heavily fortified cities in France. They shaped the battlefield without firing a shot. They bent enemy decisions without engaging directly. They misdirected the Panthers, the pride of German armor, into chasing shadows made of rubber, sound, and radio waves. In the grand sweep of the Allied advance, the feint at Metz became a hidden hinge upon which victory pivoted, proving that even the strongest fortress can be made vulnerable when its defenders are looking the wrong way.
The Battle of the Bulge erupted with a violence and ferocity that shattered the frozen stillness of December 1944 as the German army unleashed its last, desperate offensive through the dense, snow-laden forests of the Ardennes, a surprise attack that ripped a great jagged dent into the American lines and sent entire divisions reeling backward in chaos, confusion, and disbelief. The winter landscape became a canvas of white silence, punctured by the thunder of artillery, the crack of rifles, the grinding advance of panzer columns, and the screams of men caught in ambushes carved by German units who moved swiftly through the woods like phantoms of their own. It was the largest battle the U.S. Army had ever fought, and for days German momentum seemed unstoppable. Allied command structures strained, their communication lines frayed by the speed of the attack. In this maelstrom of shock, disorder, and brutal cold, every patch of terrain became critical, every river crossing a lifeline, every road junction a potential catastrophe if it fell into German hands.
The Ghost Army, whose role had always been to deceive, not fight, found itself thrust into one of the most precarious positions of the entire campaign, to create the illusion of strength in sectors where American lines were dangerously thin, to buy precious hours that would allow reinforcements to rush in, and to prevent German armored spearheads from exploiting gaps that could widen the bulge and encircle thousands of Allied troops. This was not a quiet deception like Breast Pocket, nor a calculated misdirection like Metz. This was a desperate, improvisational, high-stakes illusion staged in the midst of chaos, under conditions where failure meant annihilation. They were ordered into the Ardennes swiftly, their trucks struggling through snow-choked roads lined with the wreckage of burned vehicles, shattered trees, and abandoned equipment. The winter cold gnawed at everything. Metal froze, rubber stiffened, generators sputtered, and breath turned into clouds that hung in the air like drifting ghosts. The men of the Ghost Army could hear the distant rumble of German tanks, Panthers and Tiger IIs, pushing deeper into the American lines. They could hear artillery pounding positions just miles ahead. They could feel the tension hanging in the air, thick as the frost that coated the branches of pine trees above them. They knew that German patrols were everywhere in the forest, sweeping through the snow like wolves searching for weaknesses. And yet, in the midst of this, they had to perform their illusions. Their mission? To simulate the presence of the 75th Infantry Division and parts of the 8th Armored Division, neither of which were present in the sector at the time, in order to dissuade the Germans from exploiting what they believed was a lightly defended gap. If the Germans chose to attack through that area with their armored spearheads, the result would be devastating. A deeper thrust into Allied lines, encirclement of retreating units, and potentially a split that could cripple the entire Western Front. The Ghost Army's challenge in the Ardennes began with the terrain itself. The thick forests made visual deception difficult, as there were limited open spaces to erect inflatable tanks and artillery that would be visible from the air. But what the environment took away in visual clarity, it added in acoustic potential. Sounds echoed strangely through the woods, sometimes amplifying, sometimes dampening depending on the density of snow and trees. The sound crews studied this carefully, testing broadcasts late at night when German patrols were less likely to be close enough to hear odd distortions. They arranged their speakers among the trees, positioning them so that the echoes would travel in arcs matching the geography of real armored movements. Then, under the black winter sky, they began projecting the deep, guttural roar of tank engines, the unmistakable growl of heavy machinery idling beneath the forest canopy. They interspersed it with the clatter of chains, the crunch of treads plowing through snow, the metallic clangs of equipment being mounted, and the screams of men caught in ambushes carved by German units who moved swiftly through the woods like phantoms of their own. These broadcasts traveled far through the frozen air, creating the auditory illusion of an armored force far larger than anything actually present. Meanwhile, the inflatable tanks were deployed in clearings where they could cast long shadows at dawn, their silhouettes visible from German observation posts, hidden on ridge lines. Snow posed a risk. If too much accumulated on an inflatable tank, the weight might collapse its sides, so Ghost Army members worked through the night brushing snow from the rubber skins, maintaining the illusion even as frostbite gnawed at their fingers. They set up dummy artillery positions by carving small platforms into the snow and placing wooden howitzers on them, angling the barrels towards valleys where German forces might attempt a thrust. They built log piles and snow mounds to simulate defensive fortifications. They lit controlled fires behind tents and piles of snow camouflage netting to produce smoke that rose convincingly from occupied positions. German scouts watching from tree lines and listening through the stillness noted the signs, the engine noises, the smoke, the silhouettes in the snow. Everything suggested an American force consolidating its line. And then came the radio illusion. The Ghost Army's operators transmitted highly disciplined radio traffic that matched the communication style of the units they were impersonating. Terse, professional, cold-weather weary, with references to frozen weaponry, limited visibility, and delays due to ice.
They simulated perimeter reports, engineering updates about clearing snow for artillery emplacements, and coded references to supply shortages that were typical of real American units in the Ardennes during that brutal winter. German intercept teams, always listening, recorded the transmissions and concluded that the Americans had reinforced the sector. Their analysts sent reports to German commanders warning of increased troop presence in the forest. German officers, already cautious due to poor visibility and fuel shortages, hesitated. They chose not to advance into the sector that night. That hesitation bought the Americans time. But the deception had to be maintained, constantly. The cold made this nearly impossible. Equipment froze, generators faltered, inflatable tanks sagged as rubber stiffened in sub-zero temperatures. Radio equipment crackled unpredictably. The Ghost Army's men had to work through the night to maintain even the simplest illusions. They lit fires behind screens to keep compressors from freezing. They warmed radio batteries under heavy coats. They shoveled snow away from decoys while German patrols moved close enough that every sound had to be muffled. And all the while, artillery shells landed nearby, shaking the ground, bursting trees apart, sending splinters of wood flying through the air like shrapnel. Several times during the operation, German infantry units probed the sector, creeping through snowdrifts with weapons ready and senses sharp. Their silhouettes moved between the trees, their breath visible in the cold, their boots crunching faintly. The Ghost Army members stayed absolutely silent as these patrols passed within dangerously close proximity to their decoys. One false noise, one sign of the rubber nature of the tanks, one accidental reflection off a plywood artillery piece, any of it could have exposed the operation. But the Germans never approached close enough to investigate thoroughly. The sounds, the smoke, the radio chatter, and the silhouettes convinced them the Americans had reinforced the line. When a Panther reconnaissance unit approached one night from the east, its commander halted after hearing the deep, rumbling broadcasts echoing through the snow-coated woods. He reported the presence of American armor that was, in reality, not there. His decision not to advance in the darkness prevented what could have been a catastrophic breakthrough. Over the next 48 hours, the Germans redirected their attack elsewhere, believing the sector held by the Ghost Army was too heavily defended. Meanwhile, real American units moved into the area the Ghost Army had been protecting, filling the gap with actual strength. The Ghost Army then quietly withdrew, leaving behind faint impressions in the snow and smoldering fire pits, the ghostly remains of a division that had never existed. The deception did not win the Battle of the Bulge, but it prevented it from becoming worse. It slowed German momentum in a critical sector. It prevented a dangerous widening of the bulge. It bought time for reinforcements to arrive and for the American counterattack to stabilize the line. In a battle defined by chaos, snow, and sudden violence, the Ghost Army created calm where there should have been crisis, stability where there should have been collapse. Their illusions held back real German tanks, Panthers and Tiger IIs, with nothing but rubber, wire, sound, and breath turning to frost in the black winter night. In the Ardennes, the Ghost Army proved that deception was not merely a tool of convenience, but a weapon of survival, and that in the greatest battle of the Western Front, shadows could hold the line just as effectively as steel.
As the brutal winter of 1944-45 slowly loosened its grip on the European continent and the snow began to melt into the mud of early spring, the Allied advance resumed with renewed force, pushing westward with the singular objective that now dominated every map room, every briefing, every strategy table from Eisenhower's headquarters down to the lowest battalion commander: cross the Rhine. The Rhine River, ancient and immense, was more than a geographical barrier. It was the last great natural defense protecting the heart of Germany. Behind it lay the industrial arteries that fueled the Wehrmacht, the transportation networks that fed German divisions, and the symbolic threshold of the Third Reich's homeland. If the Allies could breach the Rhine with speed and deception, the war in Europe would rapidly collapse. If they failed, the Germans would prolong the war from defensible positions, costing thousands of lives.
And so, as the American armies surged eastward, the Ghost Army found itself once again at the center of a vast and intricate deception, this time not to protect a flank or delay a thrust, but to shape the conditions for the final assault on the Rhine by misdirecting entire German corps away from real crossing points. The operation unfolded over a fractured, chaotic landscape, where towns lay smashed by months of fighting, bridges hung in twisted steel over icy waters, forests were scarred by artillery, and roads were choked with the debris of war. German resistance, though weakened, remained fierce. Wehrmacht and SS units retreated stubbornly toward the Rhine, turning every river, hill, and village into a defensive line. Their commanders, now desperate, relied heavily on reconnaissance reports and signals intelligence to predict where the Americans would attempt to cross. They knew the Americans favored broad front, armored heavy assaults, supported by overwhelming artillery. They watched the roads for tank columns, listened to the skies for engine noise, and studied every scrap of intelligence arriving from frontline observers. The Ghost Army's mission was to manipulate all of that, to make the Germans believe the main assault would occur at one point along the Rhine, while the real blow would fall elsewhere. They were ordered to simulate the 30th and 79th Infantry Divisions, as well as elements of the 7th Armored Division near several towns along the western bank of the river, including Neuss, Dusseldorf, and the surrounding fields and villages. Their illusions needed to be large, convincing, and sustained long enough to anchor German defensive units in the wrong locations. The stakes had never been higher. The operation began with a massive logistical dance as Ghost Army convoys crept through the broken countryside under the cover of darkness. Their trucks splashed through mud, bounced over shell craters, and maneuvered through narrow roads lined with the ruins of houses blown apart by artillery. The early spring fog clung low to the ground, twisting through rubble and drifting across broken bridges, a natural camouflage that the Ghost Army used to its full advantage. As they reached the designated area, they immediately began the construction of a fictitious army preparing to cross the Rhine. Their decoys, inflatable tanks, artillery, trucks, and jeeps were placed with extraordinary precision along roads leading toward the river. They arranged entire battalion motor pools, their vehicles lined up in neat, doctrinal patterns that German aerial reconnaissance would expect to see. Under the moonlight, these rubber vehicles cast shadows as convincing as steel, turning muddy fields into scenes that looked alive with armored power. Engineers built fake bridges out of canvas and wood, covered with netting to suggest construction efforts hidden from German view. They placed false observation posts along riverbanks, where 2 or 3 uniformed figures might be seen through binoculars at long distances, appearing to survey the German shore. Dummy artillery positions were set up behind earthen berms, complete with carved-out craters and fake blast marks. The Ghost Army set up tent cities that sprawled across fields and orchards, each tent erected with exact spacing and alignment as required by U.S. Division doctrine. They added washing lines, fire pits, crates, and latrine pits, every detail that a real division would produce. These were not props casually scattered. They were arranged with scientific precision, as if the invisible hand of an entire regiment had shaped them. But visuals alone could not sell the illusion. The heart of the deception, as always, lay in the synchronization of sound, radio, and behavior. The sonic deception teams set up their massive speakers behind hedgerows, inside the shells of ruined buildings, and on ridges overlooking the Rhine. They broadcast the rumble of tanks rolling into position, the clatter of heavy machinery being prepared for bridging operations, the grinding of cranes hoisting pontoon sections, and the shouted coordination of engineers working near the water. These soundscapes were layered to create depth, near sounds, far sounds, overlapping sounds, so that German listeners would interpret them as activity from thousands of men working across miles of riverbank. Late at night, when sound traveled best across water, these broadcasts became even more potent. They drifted across the Rhine in eerie waves, ricocheting off the water's surface and echoing against the stone embankments on the far side. German patrols listening through the mist believed they were hearing the unmistakable preparations for a major river crossing. German intelligence officers received reports confirming these sounds: American armor assembling, engineering equipment operating, troop movement at night, bridging preparations detected. It was exactly what the Ghost Army wanted them to hear.
Meanwhile, the radio deception unit activated a full division-level network that mimicked the communication patterns of the real divisions they were impersonating. They transmitted reconnaissance reports describing German positions across the river, requests for artillery support, logistical updates about ammunition and fuel, and coded messages about construction delays. All the exact kind of radio traffic a real division would produce in the days leading up to a river assault. German intercept stations recorded these transmissions and updated their intelligence maps. Their analysts, already bracing for an American crossing somewhere along the western bank, concluded that the assault was imminent near the Ghost Army's simulated positions. This triggered a cascade of reactions. German units redeployed to the wrong sectors. Artillery batteries were shifted to shell the American positions where only inflatables and illusions stood. Panzer Grenadier units marched through mud and frost to reinforce the lines opposite the Ghost Army. Anti-tank guns were dragged into firing positions along riverfronts where no tanks were actually preparing to cross. Night after night, the Germans fired sporadic artillery into the Ghost Army's illusion, wasting precious ammunition on rubber and air. The deception worked beautifully. But it needed to be continuous. The Ghost Army operated under intense pressure, maintaining their illusions in dreadful weather conditions. Rain turned their fields into oceans of mud, threatening to topple inflatable tanks and soak their radio equipment. Fog rolled in unexpectedly, sometimes hiding their visuals too well, risking suspicion if the Germans noticed a sudden absence of expected signs. The men tirelessly reinforced decoys, repositioned inflatables to simulate movement, shoveled mud, brushed off water, maintained fires behind screens, and kept generators running through cold nights that seemed endlessly long. And then when the illusion reached its crescendo, the Ghost Army introduced carefully timed disruptions to make the buildup appear even more genuine. They simulated minor accidents, a sound broadcast of a pontoon section dropping into the water, followed by radio chatter discussing delays. They simulated fatigue, sporadic broadcasts of frustrated officers telling engineers to keep the work moving. They simulated urgency, new transmissions indicating the division had received orders to accelerate preparations. These details made the deception feel real, too real for the Germans to ignore. Yet while the Ghost Army maintained this illusion of mass and urgency, the real American forces were quietly shifting miles away, preparing for their true crossing sites near Remagen, Oppenheim, and Wesel. Every hour the Germans spent reinforcing the Ghost Army's sectors gave the real Allied divisions time and freedom to prepare without overwhelming opposition. And the Germans took the bait. Day after day, German commanders poured reinforcements into positions opposite the Ghost Army, convinced the Americans were preparing a massive assault. Their reports referenced everything the Ghost Army wanted them to reference: troop buildup, artillery increase, engineering activity, radio chatter matching a river crossing operation. By the time the real crossings began, German defenses in those sectors were stretched thin, drained by the fear of an attack that would never come. When the Americans finally crossed the Rhine at Remagen, capturing the Ludendorff Bridge intact, and when other crossings exploded across the river in rapid succession, the Germans were unprepared. Their reserves were misallocated, their artillery was positioned wrong, their strategic picture was broken. And the Ghost Army had been the invisible hand guiding that misperception. Even after the Americans had crossed, German intelligence continued to believe for days that additional crossings would occur at the Ghost Army's positions. Their misreading of the battlefield had become cemented in their thinking because the illusions were too complete, too consistent, too perfectly aligned with what they expected to see. The Ghost Army had deceived not only their eyes and ears, but their reasoning itself. Operation Phantom Rhine, though never officially named as such, became one of the final masterpieces of the war, a sweeping, multi-layered deception that shifted German divisions, delayed reinforcements, and accelerated the collapse of German defenses west of the Rhine. And in the end, the river that had stood as a symbol of German strength was crossed not through brute force alone, but through the guiding shadows of an army made of air, sound, and radio waves. The Ghost Army had become the architect of avenues where real divisions could advance without catastrophic resistance. The Rhine, once a barrier, was breached because the Germans had been looking in the wrong direction, towards phantoms. As the winter frost dissolved into the thick, wet mud of early 1945 and the Allied advance thundered eastward like an unstoppable tide, the war in Europe entered its final, desperate stage. Germany was collapsing, its cities shattered by relentless bombing, its armies exhausted, its fuel reserves nearly gone, and its once dreaded divisions reduced to skeletal remnants fighting with fading strength. Yet the German High Command remained dangerous, unpredictable, and capable of delivering sudden counterblows wherever it detected weakness. Every mile gained by the Allies was earned through bitter combat, and every river, ridge, and town still held the potential to become a killing ground if the enemy concentrated its forces. As Allied armies approached the western borders of Germany, they encountered the formidable Siegfried Line, a sprawling system of concrete bunkers, dragon's teeth anti-tank obstacles, camouflaged firing points, interlocking pillboxes, and trench networks carved into the land. The line was incomplete in many areas and shattered in others, yet it was still a barrier that could inflict immense casualties if attacked head-on by unprepared forces. The Ghost Army, having just played a pivotal role in misdirecting German defenses along the Rhine, was immediately tasked with one of its most sophisticated final operations of the war. A multi-pronged illusion designed to confuse German defenses along the last approach routes into the heart of the Reich. This mission had no single code name, no singular battlefield to define it. Rather, it was a tapestry of interconnected deceptions across several sectors, each one meant to create the impression of American divisions preparing to strike through specific points along the Siegfried Line, while the real thrusts prepared to rupture the line elsewhere. The Ghost Army deployed into terrain unlike anything they had encountered before. Much of western Germany was a twisted ruin, forests shattered by artillery, villages nothing more than burned-out shells, factories reduced to jagged frames of steel and brick, roads cratered and lined with bomb craters. The ground was scarred by months of combat, and cold rain turned everything into treacherous sludge. Yet it was in this bleak environment that the Ghost Army had to summon the most convincing illusions of the entire campaign. They began by simulating the presence of two major American divisions, the 80th Infantry Division and the 4th Armored Division, both of which were actively engaged elsewhere or being withheld for the final push into Germany. The deception required the Ghost Army to create sprawling encampments, vehicle concentrations, artillery firing positions, command posts, fuel depots, and movement patterns that German reconnaissance units would interpret as indicators of impending assaults. They selected their deception sites based on intelligence reports detailing where German defenses were most sensitive. Each sector demanded different illusions. In some areas, the Germans feared armored breakthroughs. In others, they feared infantry assault, supported by heavy artillery. In still others, the terrain favored mechanized infiltration, prompting German officers to watch for armored half-tracks and reconnaissance vehicles. The Ghost Army catered to all of these expectations. They positioned inflatable tanks, Shermans, Stuarts, and even rubber tank destroyers in forest clearings and along strategic roads. They angled inflatable artillery batteries behind low ridges where the barrels pointed ominously eastward. They erected full command posts with tents aligned perfectly, vehicles dispersed according to doctrine, and fake communications equipment camouflaged with netting. They built fake supply dumps, stacking empty wooden crates and fabricated fuel drums under canvases that flapped in the cold wind. They placed stacks of ammo boxes, wooden replicas painted carefully to mimic the stenciled markings that would be visible from above. Night after night, the men placed lanterns and controlled fires behind mesh screens to create the glow of activity within tents, mimicking briefing sessions, planning tables, and nighttime operations. The Ghost Army even deployed decoy bulldozers made from wood frames and canvas, positioned as though building roads, clearing obstacles, or adjusting terrain for the approach of tanks. These visuals were reinforced by physical manipulation of the land itself. They dragged tank trads across fields to create fresh track marks. They drove jeeps carrying chains to create the illusion of heavy truck convoys. They used rollers to carve deep impressions in mud where armored vehicles must have passed. They dug foxholes, trench lines, mortar pits, and latrine ditches, all to suggest the presence of thousands of soldiers. Then came the sound, the heartbeat of deception. The sonic crews studied the twisted forests and ruined towns, mapping the acoustics of broken buildings, demolished factories, and ridgelines. They placed their speakers inside half-collapsed barns, behind shattered stone walls, or within the skeletons of bombed-out warehouses. These placements created eerie natural amplifiers. A tank engine rumble could bounce off a brick wall and resonate for hundreds of yards. Artillery loading sounds could echo through an empty factory shell. Shouted orders could ripple across hills and return in distorted fragments, making the illusion seem all the more chaotic and real. The nightly broadcasts filled the darkness with the vibrations of military preparation, the grinding of tank treads being tested, the rhythmic clatter of artillery crews loading shells, the groaning of cranes lifting heavy equipment, and the shouts of officers directing troops to reposition. The eerie sound of tracked vehicles rolling through mud carried far into German lines, where listening posts reported the arrival of armored battalions. Just as important was the radio illusion, which tied the entire deception together like threads in an intricate tapestry. The Ghost Army's signal experts created full division-level communication networks, transmitting messages that mirrored the activity of real units, reconnaissance reports describing German bunkers, logistics messages complaining about minefields, artillery units reporting calibration issues, and command posts issuing coded warnings of possible German counterattacks. These transmissions were carefully timed to align with the visual and acoustic cues. If inflatable tanks were deployed in new formations, radio chatter mentioned relocation. If sound trucks broadcast the noise of engineering equipment, radio messages referenced obstacle clearing operations. Every illusion reinforced every other. German intercept teams recorded all of it. Their analysts, overwhelmed by the complexity and consistency of the signals, concluded that several American divisions were indeed preparing for breakthroughs along the Siegfried Line. This assessment triggered reaction after reaction among German commanders. They reinforced the wrong sectors, moving exhausted infantry battalions, precious artillery units, and rare armored vehicles into positions facing the Ghost Army's illusions. They sent patrols to probe the American lines, only to encounter carefully staged traces of activity designed to keep them cautious but unwilling to commit too close. In some areas, the Ghost Army even staged controlled skirmishes using sound alone, recorded bursts of machine gun fire, simulated mortar blasts, and shouted commands that made German patrols believe they had stumbled upon real American outposts. The psychological effect was immediate. German reports described significant enemy presence and preparations for attack even when the real American divisions were miles away. As the deception deepened, the Germans reacted exactly as the Allies hoped. They stiffened their lines where the Americans did not intend to strike, leaving other stretches of the Siegfried Line weakened. And when the real assaults came, near Bitburg, Prüm, Saarlauten, and other critical points, the Germans were caught off guard, outnumbered, and poorly positioned. Their defenses crumbled faster than Allied planners had dared to hope. But the Ghost Army's operations did not end there. As the Americans pierced the Siegfried Line and poured into Germany, the Germans continued to rely heavily on reconnaissance and signals intelligence, desperate to predict where the next blow would fall. So the Ghost Army continued to project false troop movements, false buildups, and false concentrations, even simulating entire divisions retreating or advancing in areas where there were none. They created the impression of American columns moving north when they were really swinging south. They staged fake withdrawal patterns that made the Germans believe the Americans were abandoning one line of advance in favor of another. The illusions created a sense of unpredictability in the German high command. Some analysts complained that the Americans were moving too quickly to track. Others believed the Americans had far more forces than they actually possessed. Some began to suspect that U.S. divisions were capable of appearing in two places at once. Confusion spread. Uncertainty fractured the cohesiveness of German strategy. The Ghost Army had successfully transformed themselves from a tactical deception unit into an operational weapon. In the final months before Germany's collapse, they became a force of distortion, bending the enemy's understanding of the battlefield, reshaping
Their decisions and accelerating their strategic unraveling. They controlled where German divisions marched, where they entrenched, where they wasted precious ammunition, and where they exhausted their remaining tanks. And all the while, the Ghost Army remained unseen, uncredited, and anonymous. As the last illusions before Germany were carried out, the men of the Ghost Army understood the significance of their work. They were not simply tricking an enemy. They were altering the course of the war. They were making the battlefield a maze of ghosts, shadows, and falsehoods. They were guiding the American armies through the final obstacles with illusions so convincing that even after the German front collapsed, enemy intelligence units continued to reference divisions that had never existed in those sectors. The final illusions before Germany paved the way for the Allied thrust into the heart of the Reich. And through these illusions, the Ghost Army made the impossible possible. They shaped victory not with firepower, but with imagination.
Operation Viersen became the Ghost Army's greatest masterpiece, an enormous, sweeping deception so flawlessly executed, so breathtaking in scale, and so strategically decisive that it became the operation in which every lesson learned, every technique perfected, and every illusion ever crafted by the unit converged into a single, dazzling performance. It unfolded in March 1945, at the moment when the Allied armies stood poised to cross the Rhine River in strength, determined to punch through the last major natural barrier standing between them and the heart of Nazi Germany. The Rhine had already been crossed unexpectedly at Remagen, where the Ludendorff Bridge fell into American hands intact, but that crossing alone could not support the massive wave of men, armor, and artillery needed to invade Germany on a broad front. Massive crossing operations were being prepared farther north and south, and these real crossings needed cover. They needed time, and they needed the enemy to be looking in the wrong place. That was the purpose of Operation Viersen, and it would become the crowning achievement of the Ghost Army's entire wartime existence. Their mission? To simulate the presence and buildup of two full divisions, the 30th and 79th Infantry Divisions, as well as supporting armored elements, across a wide stretch of land near the town of Viersen, north of Düsseldorf, directly opposite a heavily defended German sector. The illusion needed to convince German intelligence, German artillery observers, German scouts, and German signals analysts that a major American crossing was imminent at Viersen. If successful, German forces would be drawn north, leaving the real crossing sites miles away, undermanned, weakened, and vulnerable. The stakes were monumental. A single misstep, a tent that looked wrong, a radio transmission mistimed, a sound broadcast that failed to match German expectations could collapse the illusion. But if the deception succeeded, it would become one of the largest strategic misdirections in the European theater. The Ghost Army arrived quietly in the days preceding the operation, their trucks moving under the cover of darkness across muddy, crowded roads clogged with supply convoys, retreating German units, destroyed vehicles, shattered trees, and the detritus of a collapsing front. The fields around Viersen were waterlogged from weeks of rain and melting snow, their surfaces scarred by the tracks of retreating German armor and dotted with the ruins of farmhouses blasted apart by artillery. The terrain was a mixture of open farmland, scattered woods, and low ridges, perfect for staging illusions visible to German aerial reconnaissance and vulnerable to German forward observers peering through binoculars across the Rhine. At dawn, the Ghost Army began the construction of their phantom force. Inflatable tanks were placed with meticulous care across fields and meadows. Rows of rubber Shermans appeared overnight, arranged in staggered formations designed to look like battalions preparing for river crossing operations. Inflatable half-tracks and jeeps were positioned along roads, their silhouettes captured in the early morning mist. Dummy artillery batteries, complete with rubber barrels and painted blast shields, were positioned behind hedgerows where their positions would be visible but not close enough for German gunners to distinguish their falseness. The visual illusion unfolded across miles of landscape. Hundreds of tents were erected, their canvas surfaces billowing in the wind, arranged in doctrinal layouts corresponding to regimental headquarters, battalion command posts, medical tents, supply depots, and sleeping quarters. The Ghost Army created the illusion of thousands of men by constructing secondary details with obsessive precision. Footprints pressed into mud with boot molds, wagon ruts carved with rollers, clotheslines hung with uniform shirts, smoke from controlled fires rising in the chilly morning air, discarded ration tins scattered in appropriate quantities, and paths beaten into the earth as though trodden by hundreds of boots. Fields that had been empty the day before were suddenly alive with the unmistakable footprint of a major American force. Meanwhile, the sonic teams began their most ambitious sound projection to date. They created layered broadcasts that simulated the entire buildup of a river-crossing army, engineering teams assembling pontoon bridges, cranes lowering heavy equipment, tank battalions moving into concealed staging areas, artillery units adjusting their firing positions, and trucks bringing in ammunition crates. These sounds were projected from multiple points, creating a shifting auditory scene that German observers interpreted as authentic preparation for a massive Rhine crossing. Sound carried across the flat land with chilling clarity. At night, the broadcasts became even more dramatic. The deep thrum of tank engines echoed across the fields. The metallic clangs of bridge components being assembled drifted into the dark. The steady growl of trucks delivering supplies reverberated across the river. German scouts listening from the far bank reported heavy engineering sounds, concluding that the Americans were planning to launch their crossing within days. The coordination between sound, visual decoys, and radio was exquisite. The radio deception unit simulated full division-level communications, everything from commanders reviewing maps to infantry units discussing river reconnaissance, from artillery batteries coordinating fire missions to logistics officers reporting fuel shortages. The transmissions were flawless, each one reinforcing the illusion projected by the visual and acoustic teams. German signals intelligence intercepted the messages and incorporated them into their intelligence reports. They noted the presence of units that were not actually there. They recorded the buildup of divisions preparing for a crossing. They warned their commanders that the Americans were massing across from Viersen. The Germans reacted exactly as the Allies hoped. Entire battalions shifted north towards Viersen. Heavy artillery repositioned to shell the Ghost Army's phantom forces. German commanders, already stretched thin, redeployed precious armored reserves to counter what they believed would be an American breakthrough. Meanwhile, the real American divisions preparing to cross the Rhine, far to the south near Oppenheim and Wessel, encountered far less resistance than expected. Operation Viersen reached its crescendo when the Ghost Army staged simulated nighttime movements that suggested their divisions were getting ready for the final assault. They broadcast the sound of troops marching, trucks pulling into formation, tank engines powering up, and engineering teams working feverishly on last-minute river preparations. At dawn, inflatable tanks were repositioned in new formations. New tents were erected. New tire tracks were carved into the mud. Radio traffic intensified. German observers interpreted all of this as the unmistakable signs of an imminent attack. Then came the final stroke of genius. Just hours before the real crossings began far to the south, the Ghost Army simulated the beginning of an artillery bombardment, using sound alone. They broadcast the thunderous booms of guns firing preparatory barrages. They staggered the sounds so that some seemed distant while others seemed close. They interspersed broadcasts of shouted commands, urgent radio calls, and the rumbling of tanks pushing toward the river. German units braced for impact. They tightened their lines. They waited for the Americans to come crashing out of the mist. But nothing came. No shells fell. No tanks advanced. No boat splashed into the water. And all the while, miles away, the real spearheads of the American army surged across the Rhine with lightning speed, achieving stunning success before the Germans could react. By the time the German high command realized their mistake, it was too late. Operation Viersen had frozen thousands of German troops in the wrong place at the worst possible moment. Field Marshal Model, who commanded German Army Group B, later learned that he had been duped by illusions, rubber tanks, sound recordings, and carefully crafted radio lies. The success of the deception was so complete that even after the Rhine had been crossed, German intelligence continued monitoring the Ghost Army's sector, believing additional divisions were still preparing to assault. Operation Viersen was the perfect deception, massive in scale, flawless in execution, and devastating in strategic impact. It was the Ghost Army's crowning achievement, the moment when an army of phantoms shaped the destiny of nations. Without firing a shot, they helped assure the collapse of Germany's last defensive line. Without killing a single enemy soldier, they altered the course of the war. And as the American army surged into the heart of the Third Reich, the Ghost Army quietly dismantled their illusions, rolling up their rubber tanks, silencing their speakers, and packing away their radios, leaving behind only empty fields and footprints in the mud where thousands of imaginary soldiers had once stood.
As the Rhine crossing succeeded with breathtaking speed and the Allied army surged deep into Germany like a gathering storm, the war entered its final, chaotic, and strangely surreal phase, one in which the German military, once capable of orchestrating lightning offensives across continents, now fought in disjointed fragments amid a collapsing homeland, its command fractured, its infrastructure shattered, its cities burned out and hollowed by firebombs. Yet even as their world fell apart, the Germans remained dangerous, cornered, unpredictable, and prone to desperate counterattacks wherever they sensed weakness. Every mile forward was contested by pockets of resistance, shattered infantry units hiding in the rubble of medieval towns, fanatical Volkssturm militias armed with old rifles and Panzerfausts, SS units launching ambushes from forests turned skeletal by winter, and the remnants of panzer brigades fighting rearguard actions with their last fuel, their last shells, their last willpower. In this swirling chaos, this collapsing mixture of resistance, retreat, and rage, the Ghost Army was summoned into Germany not as mere deceivers, but as architects of illusion, tasked with accelerating the disintegration of the German defensive network. Their mission was to confuse, distort, and fracture German intelligence in the final weeks of the war, ensuring that the enemy's dwindling resources were misallocated, their strategic vision clouded, and their efforts to regroup or counterattack rendered futile. It was the most unpredictable work the Ghost Army had ever attempted. For Germany itself, the geography, the terrain, the ruined cities, the desperate enemy created a battlefield unlike anything they had faced before. The first challenge lay in the landscape. Western Germany in early 1945 was a wasteland of scorched forests, shattered bridges, bomb-blasted factories, and towns reduced to mazes of broken walls and collapsed roofs. Roads were clogged with fleeing civilians, retreating soldiers, burned-out trucks, and the twisted carcasses of tanks destroyed in earlier battles. Fields were churned into muck by endless artillery bombardments. Long columns of refugees trudged along the roads, pushing carts of belongings, guiding children through the ruins, moving silently like ghosts themselves. And threaded through this entire devastation were German units, fragmented, exhausted, but still lethal. Scattered machine gun nests hid in basements beneath collapsed houses, snipers perched among splintered rafters, artillery spotters haunted the bell towers of ruined churches. These isolated forces watched every American movement with suspicion, desperate to slow the advance. Into this apocalyptic landscape rolled the Ghost Army. Their trucks rattled down roads scarred with craters, past the skeletons of factories and the smoldering remains of cities that had been bomb-blasted into ash. Their mission sites lay near crossroads, rail junctions, ridge lines, and small towns that the Germans might use as staging grounds for counterattacks. The Ghost Army's challenge was to make these points appear heavily defended even when actual American units were not yet present in strength. Their presence had to be subtle yet unmistakable, overwhelming yet believable. They needed to build illusions inside ruins. And so they began transforming the rubble around them into deceptive battlefields. Inflatable tanks were placed inside the skeletal remains of destroyed warehouses, their rubber frames partially hidden behind shattered concrete so that reconnaissance planes glimpsing them from above saw only the angled silhouettes of armored vehicles concealed among wreckage. Phantom artillery pieces, rubber howitzers, and wooden guns were positioned in church courtyards, behind collapsed walls, and inside craters dug by real explosives. Plywood tank destroyers were parked under rail bridges and beside bombed-out train cars. From the sky, these looked like armored forces taking cover among the ruins, exactly where American units would hide from German fire. The Ghost Army went further, performing the most intricate visual illusions of their entire campaign. They created fake roadblocks using wooden beams, barbed wire, and sandbags. They set up anti-tank positions with camouflage netting stretched across rubble piles. They painted misleading star insignia on decoy vehicles and structures so they would appear unmistakably American to any observer. They arranged supply dumps using fabricated crates and fuel drums stacked within the frames of destroyed buildings, illusions designed to make German intelligence believe that significant American logistical hubs existed where there were none. The enemy's interpretation of ruins became the Ghost Army's greatest weapon. At the same time, the sonic deception teams prepared their largest and most elaborate soundscapes for urban warfare. Unlike the open fields, forests, and rivers where they had conducted earlier missions, the bombed-out cities of Germany created an acoustic nightmare. Echoes bounced unpredictably between broken walls, sounds amplified inside hollow buildings, and the wind carried noise in uneven patterns through narrow streets and open squares. But with careful testing, the Ghost Army transformed this chaotic soundscape into a weapon of staggering potency. They placed speakers inside the shells of ruined buildings so that broadcasts reverberated across the ruins with haunting realism. The deep rumble of tank engines echoed down shattered streets. The metallic clatter of tracked vehicles moving over cobblestones bounced between collapsed storefronts. The bark of American artillery firing from phantom positions rolled through courtyards and bomb craters. They broadcast the sounds of bulldozers clearing debris, trucks maneuvering in town squares, engineers detonating charges to remove obstacles, and infantry patrols barking commands as they swept through city blocks. To German listeners hidden in buildings or bunkers beyond the town, these sounds created an unmistakable impression. Large American forces were consolidating in the area, preparing for a push deeper into Germany. And because the ruins distorted the sound, the Germans could not pinpoint the exact location. They could only estimate the scale. That uncertainty became paralyzing. Meanwhile, the radio deception teams wove a web of false communication so convincing that German intelligence analysts became thoroughly deceived. They created entire networks of signals for divisions that did not exist in the sector, transmitting coded orders about seizing rail junctions, discussions about clearing minefields, reports of enemy snipers in nearby towns, and coordination messages for imaginary supply convoys. These transmissions were intercepted by German signals units and propagated through their intelligence channels, reinforcing the visual and acoustic cues created by the Ghost Army. The Germans believed that multiple American divisions were advancing faster and in greater numbers than reality. This forced German commanders to redeploy units erratically, pulling battle groups away from sectors where they might have organized a coherent defense, sending panzer remnants to guard phantom targets, and scattering what little artillery they had left across areas of no strategic value.
The Ghost Army's illusions, layered and dynamic, triggered a cascade of misjudgments at the highest levels of German operational command. But their mission was not merely to mislead the enemy about American strength, it was to protect genuine American advances that were now vulnerable as they plunged deeper into Germany. In several towns and villages ahead of the main American spearheads, the Ghost Army created temporary illusions of strong defensive positions, causing German rearguard units to hesitate, delay, or withdraw without engaging. In other areas, they simulated powerful armored columns moving toward one flank, prompting the Germans to pull forces away from the actual axis of American attack. This acceleration of German disorganization proved critical. German command structures crumbled under the weight of contradictory intelligence. Reports flowed in from field units, sightings of American tanks that did not exist, radio chatter from divisions that were elsewhere, sound signatures of phantom engineering battalions clearing destroyed bridges. German commanders, already juggling the near-impossible task of responding to real breakthroughs, now found themselves unable to distinguish real threats from illusions. Their reaction times slowed. Their counterattacks were mistimed. Their reserves were deployed without effect. Meanwhile, the American army advanced rapidly, meeting less resistance than expected in many sectors. Every hour the Ghost Army bought through deception saved American lives. Yet their operations were not without danger. German patrols roamed the ruins, sometimes wandering perilously close to the Ghost Army's decoy positions. Artillery shells fell indiscriminately, smashing buildings where decoys were hidden. Snipers lurked in dark corners of collapsed structures. More than once, sound teams had to pause broadcasts as German scouts passed nearby, listening for signs of weakness. But the illusions held, and as the days passed, the enemy's capacity for coherent response dissolved further. The Germans could not mount a sustained defense when their understanding of reality was fractured into 1,000 confused impressions. The Ghost Army had become the invisible architect of the battlefield's disintegration. By April 1945, the American spearheads were driving at breathtaking speed toward the Elbe River. German resistance collapsed into isolated strongpoints. Entire units surrendered upon encountering what they believed to be overwhelming American forces that, in truth, were partially illusions crafted by the Ghost Army. In the final weeks before Germany's surrender, the Ghost Army continued to manipulate the battlefield from the shadows, creating false concentrations of troops to steer German remnants away from evacuation routes, protecting real divisions as they advanced, and shaping the battlefield in ways that saved countless lives. The Ghost Army's work in these final operations was quieter, less glamorous, and buried within the chaos of collapsing lines, but it was no less critical. Their illusions accelerated the disintegration of the Reich's final defenses.
Their shadows pulled German forces into dead ends. Their phantoms marched through the ruins of a dying empire, unseen yet unmistakably present. And as Germany's military structure dissolved into fragments, the Ghost Army's deceptions became the final strokes of confusion that pushed the enemy into irreversible collapse. As April 1945 opened across a devastated continent, the German Reich stood in the final convulsions of its collapse, like a massive, wounded machine grinding toward stillness while shedding sparks of violence in all directions. The Allied armies were pressing from every angle now, Americans and British from the west, Soviets from the east, Canadian and French forces driving through the remnants of the Ruhr, and smaller Allied contingents moving through the south and southwest. Yet even as the German command structure disintegrated, even as their armies fractured into isolated clusters of exhausted soldiers with little ammunition and even less hope, they remained capable of sudden, desperate resistance. Ambushes launched by fanatics, scattered counterattacks fueled by the illusion of a last stand, and pockets of defiance that could still inflict hundreds of casualties if encountered unprepared. It was in this environment of unpredictable danger, collapsing morale, and chaotic deployments that the Ghost Army undertook its final sequences of deception, a series of operations designed not to misdirect a vast, coordinated German army as before, but to confuse the dying fragments of a once mighty force, ensuring that no last-minute counterattacks, no hastily assembled formations, no desperate thrusts could obstruct the Allied advance or cost unnecessary lives. Their final mission set did not unfold in a single place, nor did it revolve around one spectacular illusion like Operation Viersen. Instead, it spanned numerous towns, bridges, river crossings, road junctions, and forest clearings, each one a potential flashpoint where real American divisions were vulnerable as they moved rapidly through Germany. The terrain had changed drastically since the earlier stages of the campaign. Gone were the stable front lines, the great fortified towns, the methodical German defenses of 1944. In their place lay a chaotic patchwork of resistance, shattered units hiding in woods, armored remnants ambushing on country roads, SS detachments refusing to surrender, command posts buried inside ruined villas, and Volkssturm militia scattered across fields with makeshift weapons. Intelligence was murky. Some German units tried to break east to surrender to the Americans instead of the Soviets. Others tried to hold symbolic towns for as long as possible. Others were simply lost. In this fluid, collapsing battlefield, the Ghost Army's illusions became a force multiplier, guiding the flow of German retreat, blocking routes where Allied forces were exposed, and discouraging concentrations of resistance in key areas. Their operations began with a deceptively simple task: prevent German units from assembling a meaningful defensive line anywhere in front of the advancing American spearheads. To accomplish this, the Ghost Army created the illusion of American concentrations, phantom regiments, fake artillery positions, false armored columns, in locations where the Americans were not strong, making the Germans believe that any attempt to regroup would result in immediate annihilation. They moved into rapidly shifting sectors, their convoys racing along roads packed with Allied vehicles, retreating German soldiers, liberated civilians, and the detritus of war. Every day brought a new mission, a new sector, a new stretch of broken land where they needed to build illusions with almost no time to prepare. In one town, they erected inflatable tanks inside the ruins of a textile factory, using its broken brick walls as camouflage. In another, they positioned dummy artillery in the courtyard of a burned-out schoolhouse. In forest clearings, they placed rubber tank destroyers under camouflage netting, leaving tire tracks in the mud that pointed toward non-existent battalion staging grounds. In bombed-out villages, they set up fake roadblocks and created the impression of American infantry digging into defensive positions, even though no such force was present. The sonic deception teams adapted to the ruins with an expertise born from months of varied operations. They placed their massive speakers inside destroyed warehouses, behind collapsed barns, and beneath bridges shattered by explosives. The echoes produced by these structures gave their broadcasts a chilling realism that made them seem even larger and more threatening than in earlier operations. They projected the following illusions with terrifying skill: the clatter of tanks moving through narrow streets, their treads grinding over rubble; the roar of armored engines echoing off stone walls; the rhythmic thud of artillery being fired, bouncing through empty valleys; the shouted coordination of infantry squads preparing urban defenses; the scraping of engineers clearing mines or obstacles; the grinding of cranes lifting heavy equipment; and even the sporadic rattle of machine guns as if American rearguards were preparing for a German counterattack. German scouts listening from basements or forest edges heard these sounds and reported strong American presences. Their commanders, already operating with fractured intelligence and insufficient reconnaissance, hesitated to attack. In many cases, they turned away from a sector entirely, choosing safer routes of retreat or scattering into the countryside.
The Ghost Army's radio deception teams added layers of credibility to the illusions by transmitting hyper-realistic communications that mimicked the patterns, phrasing, and urgency of real American divisions. They broadcast battalion-level discussions about enemy armor concentrations, regimental coordination to secure the crossroads, engineering reports describing mine-clearing operations, and even logistical complaints about fuel shortages delaying the column. German signals units intercepted this traffic and grew convinced that entire divisions occupied ground that in reality held only a handful of illusionists with inflatable tanks and carefully curated sound systems. One of the most strategically valuable elements of these final deceptions involved road junction control. As the American army advanced deeper into Germany, long armored columns became vulnerable when navigating intersections, bridges, and narrow village streets. If the Germans launched a counterattack at one of these bottlenecks, even with only a few anti-tank guns or a stray panzer, the results could be catastrophic. And so, the Ghost Army moved ahead of the spearheads, creating illusions of heavily fortified American positions at junctions where the Germans might attack. They broadcast the sound of tank patrols guarding roads, set up dummy checkpoints with military police wearing authentic American patches, erected fake anti-tank obstacles, and populated buildings with silhouettes and mannequins to create the impression of full platoons guarding the area. German columns, upon encountering these illusions, often chose alternate routes that led them into real American units prepared to capture them, or into dead ends where they were isolated and surrendered. These illusions collapsed German mobility. Equally important was preventing German units from consolidating in towns large enough to form strongpoints. The Ghost Army achieved this by placing decoys around the outskirts of towns, broadcasting the sounds of American armor approaching, and simulating division-level radio traffic about encirclement operations. These illusions often convinced German commanders that their towns were already surrounded, leading them to abandon positions without a fight. In several cases, towns surrendered to real American forces without resistance, unaware that the forces they feared were rubber tanks and recordings played across shattered walls. As April progressed, German resistance deteriorated further, but it also became more erratic. Fanatical SS units moved unpredictably. Isolated panzer crews launched reckless attacks with their last tanks and last drops of fuel. Volkssturm militia fired from broken doorways before fleeing. The Ghost Army had to adapt constantly, shifting their illusions in hours rather than days. They created the impression of American armor moving south, then west, then east, all according to the needs of the moment and always without real tanks in the area. Their mobility made German intelligence believe that American divisions were far more numerous than reality, that they could appear anywhere, overwhelm anything, at any time. This belief accelerated the German collapse. A crucial turning point came when American spearheads approached the Elbe River. The Germans were expected to launch a final counterattack here to protect their retreat eastward. To prevent this, the Ghost Army deployed a final sprawling deception, simulating the arrival of multiple armored divisions near several key crossing points. German commanders, already overwhelmed, became convinced that the Americans had massed overwhelming force along the Elbe River. Believing resistance to be hopeless, many units surrendered without firing a shot. Others retreated into sectors controlled by the Soviets, sealing their fate. Those who attempted to regroup found themselves moving toward phantom American concentrations. By late April, the Ghost Army was performing deceptions in rapid succession, sometimes building an illusion in the morning, dismantling it by night, and driving 30 miles to construct a new one before dawn. Their final missions blurred together in a haze of tire tracks, decoys, sound systems, smoke pots, and radio broadcasts. The Germans, once proud masters of battlefield deception, were now being manipulated by shadows, misled by illusions, and defeated by armies that did not exist. In others, they withdrew eastward, straight into areas controlled by the Soviets. The Ghost Army's Elbe deception had created a final curtain of confusion through which the Third Reich stumbled blindly toward its end. By the time German commanders realized the assault would never come, the American army was already locking down positions, bridges were secured, and the German collapse had accelerated beyond repair. And so, in the dying days of the war, on the banks of a river that had witnessed centuries of history, the Ghost Army performed its last great illusion. Not with the fanfare of victory, not with the spectacle of a final battle, but with the quiet, haunting brilliance that had defined them from the very beginning. Their phantom tanks, phantom guns, phantom soldiers, and phantom armies shaped the battlefield one last time. And as the real American troops reached the Elbe and halted, watching the smoke of Berlin rise in the eastern sky, the Ghost Army packed away their decoys, silenced their speakers, folded their camouflage nets, and prepared for the end. Their final deception had helped ensure that the war ended faster, with fewer casualties, and with the enemy too bewildered to mount any meaningful final stand. They had become shadows in the ruins, ghosts in the fog, illusions that guided armies and shaped history. Operation Elbe, the last great illusion, stood as the quiet climax of their extraordinary war.
By late April 1945, the Allied advance had raced across Germany with such velocity that the landscape itself seemed unable to keep pace. The front lines shifting faster than field maps could be updated, villages liberated before their names reached headquarters, and German units splintering into disorganized clusters searching desperately for escape routes. The ultimate Allied objective was now the Elbe River, a sweeping and ancient waterway that carved through the heart of northern Germany like a final imposing barrier between the advancing Western armies and the rapidly approaching Soviet forces. The Americans knew that the war's final phase, the collapse of the Third Reich, was imminent, but they also understood that these last days of fighting carried dangerous potential for catastrophic clashes. German units seeking to flee westward to avoid Soviet capture might attempt last-minute counterattacks. Cities might transform into desperate strongpoints. Bridges might become traps, and retreating forces might stumble directly into American spearheads. To secure the crossings, avoid unnecessary casualties, and prevent a mass of German troops from reorganizing into a final defensive stand, the Ghost Army was ordered to deploy one last major illusion, an operation later remembered as one of their most brilliant, eerie, and strategically decisive actions: the phantom buildup along the Elbe. Their mission was to simulate a large American army group preparing for a major offensive across the Elbe, even though the real objective was simply to halt west of the river and allow the Soviets to take the final plunge into Berlin. Eisenhower did not want the Americans to fight deep inside the Soviet-designated zone, and thus he intentionally slowed certain movements. But the Germans, unaware of the political agreements dictating Allied actions, still feared an American assault across the Elbe. This fear gave the Ghost Army leverage. If they could convince the Germans that an imminent American crossing was coming, complete with armor concentrations, artillery staging, pontoon bridge construction, and massive troop movements, then German commanders would commit their remaining forces to defend the wrong sectors, surrender prematurely, or abandon attempts to form organized resistance. And so, the Ghost Army began constructing its final great mirage. They arrived in the river's vicinity under the gray, heavy skies of a war's dying days, where smoke drifted lazily from villages burned during earlier engagements, and where the air carried the dull thunder of artillery from distant Soviet advances. The terrain was unlike the hedgerows of Normandy or the forests of the Ardennes. It consisted of vast open floodplains, low embankments, scattered forests, and gentle rises overlooking the river. Visibility was excellent in some areas, treacherous in others. German reconnaissance posts dotted the far bank, desperate to gather information in the war's final hours. The Ghost Army would need to operate boldly, but with surgical precision. They began by establishing phantom armored concentrations along several kilometers of riverbank.
Inflatable Sherman and Stuart tanks rolled off trucks and were set up in pre-selected positions, behind clusters of trees, in shallow depressions that provided plausible cover, and along roads leading toward villages perched above the water. Each tank was arranged in doctrinal formations, nothing too neat or artificial, everything staggered, everything looking like an army preparing for movement. Fake half-tracks were positioned near dirt roads. Dummy artillery batteries were placed on gentle ridges with excellent firing arcs toward the opposite bank. They built entire fake field headquarters, rows of tents aligned precisely, camouflage nets stretched over fabricated communication gear, false command posts set inside ruined buildings, and even wooden trucks with painted windows parked in tight, convincing clusters. Every element told the same story: an American assault was coming. To reinforce this visual deception, the Ghost Army engaged in one of the most extensive landscape manipulations of their entire war. They carved fresh tank tracks into the soft ground, using rollers and real vehicles. They gouged deep ruts that looked like heavy artillery had been dragged into position. They dug foxholes, reinforced them with logs, then abandoned them at slight angles to suggest constant troop movement. They built fake supply depots with stacks of empty crates, tarps draped over barrels, and ammunition boxes arranged beside illusory firing positions. They scattered ration tins and empty jerry cans, not randomly, but with the precise messiness of thousands of soldiers. Then came the sound, the heartbeat of deception. The sonic teams placed their enormous speakers inside ruined barns, under wooden bridges, and behind heaps of rubble. They tested how sound traveled across the Elbe, how low frequencies echoed across water, how high-frequency details carried along embankments, how quickly sound dissipated across open plains. The results were remarkable. The river's broad surface acted like a natural amplifier, sending sounds rolling for tremendous distances. The Ghost Army capitalized on this by broadcasting the thunder of tank engines revving in groups, the shriek of metal on metal as pontoon sections were unloaded, the steady booming of artillery calibration, and the grinding of cranes lowering equipment toward the river. They layered these sounds carefully, so that at any given moment the Germans might hear engineers barking commands, trucks arriving in convoy, or heavy vehicle tracks crunching over mud. The effect was haunting. Across the river, German observers, exhausted, frightened, waiting for a final battle, heard the unmistakable preparations of a major American offensive. At night, the soundscape grew even more dramatic. Under the glow of the moon and the flickering light of flare bursts from distant fighting, the Ghost Army projected the noise of massive troop movements, boots marching in platoon-sized groupings, shouted orders echoing across fields, the clatter of weapons being prepared, and even the rhythmic pounding of pile drivers installing bridge supports. These broadcasts were the most immersive sonic illusion the Ghost Army had ever performed. German patrols reported them with urgency. And with these sounds, the Ghost Army introduced a subtle twist, the illusion of engineering failures and delays. They broadcast simulated accidents, pontoon sections clattering into the water, frustrated American voices shouting about anchors failing to hold, metallic crashes followed by silence. These imperfections made the illusion seem real. Meanwhile, the radio deception team wove an intricate network of fabricated division-level communications. They simulated entire regiments coordinating river reconnaissance, discussing artillery priority targets, reporting German troop concentrations, and referencing bridging difficulties caused by the river's current. They sent messages about delays due to fuel shortages, sudden German artillery hits on bridge staging areas, and requests for reinforcements to arrive from non-existent divisions. German signals units, listening desperately, intercepted all of it. Their analysts traced the communications, identified fictitious regiments, and reported them to headquarters. German intelligence concluded that at least 3 American divisions were preparing to cross the Elbe, far more than were actually present. The Germans began redeploying their last coherent forces towards the Ghost Army sector. Remnants of panzer units, some which consisted of only 2 or 3 tanks, repositioned in the night. Infantry groups retreated from other sectors, seeking to reinforce what they believed to be the impending American assault zone. Artillery batteries shifted their barrels, bridges were rigged with explosives, minefields were hurriedly laid in the wrong locations. The Ghost Army watched these movements through binoculars and intelligence reports.
They saw the German lines thinning elsewhere. They watched their deceptions shape the battlefield in real time. Their illusions were turning the Elbe into a magnet for German fear. But the Ghost Army's final brilliance came in how they orchestrated the illusion of momentum. They did not simply simulate a stationary buildup, they created the impression that American troops were tightening the noose. Every day, they moved some inflatable tanks forward, shifted tent lines closer to the river, cut new tracks, and rearranged dummy artillery in patterns suggesting preparation for an assault. They increased radio traffic to imply urgency. They added more smoke pots to simulate cooking fires for phantom soldiers. They projected new sound effects, engines revving harder, equipment moving more frequently, even the faint splash of boats during nighttime reconnaissance. The Germans grew certain the Americans were about to cross. And then, at the peak of tension, the moment when the Germans were fully convinced, the Ghost Army executed the final stage of deception. They simulated the beginning of an artillery bombardment using only sound. Thunderous reports echoed across the river. The noise rumbled through the ground and bounced off the water. German observers believed the Americans were softening the far bank for a crossing. Troops took cover. Officers shouted orders. Machine gun nests prepared for assault. But then the barrage stopped, and nothing followed. Hours passed. Dawn broke. No real assault came. The Germans, confused, waited for another attack. Meanwhile, miles away, real American units moved swiftly along the river, capturing towns with minimal resistance because the Germans had shifted forces towards the Ghost Army's illusions. In some sectors, German troops surrendered outright, believing themselves surrounded by American divisions that did not exist. In others, they withdrew eastward, straight into areas controlled by the Soviets. The Ghost Army's Elbe deception had created a final curtain of confusion through which the Third Reich stumbled blindly towards its end. By the time German commanders realized the assault would never come, the American army was already locking down positions, bridges were secured, and the German collapse had accelerated beyond repair. And so, in the dying days of the war, on the banks of a river that had witnessed centuries of history, the Ghost Army performed its last great illusion, not with the fanfare of victory, not with the spectacle of a final battle, but with the quiet, haunting brilliance that had defined them from the very beginning. Their phantom tanks, phantom guns, phantom soldiers, and phantom armies shaped the battlefield
one last time. And as the real American troops reached the Elbe and halted, watching the smoke of Berlin rise in the eastern sky, the Ghost Army packed away their decoys, silenced their speakers, folded their camouflage nets, and prepared for the end. Their final deception had helped ensure that the war ended faster, with fewer casualties, and with the enemy too bewildered to mount any meaningful final stand. They had become shadows in the ruins, ghosts in the fog, illusions that guided armies and shaped history. Operation Elbe, the last great illusion, stood as the quiet climax of their extraordinary war. As May 1945 dawned over a continent exhausted beyond measure, the thunder of war faded into distant rumblings, the skies over Europe grew quiet, and the armies that had once clashed with titanic ferocity began to slow, halt, and finally stand still. Roads once packed with tanks and trucks now carried columns of surrendered soldiers, abandoned equipment, and refugees returning to the shattered remains of homes. The German Wehrmacht, once feared across Europe, had collapsed into pockets of surrender and scattered remnants. Berlin had fallen. Hitler was dead. The Third Reich imploded from the inside like a collapsing star. But while the world's attention focused on the dramatic final battles and the symbolic gestures of surrender, an equally profound moment unfolded in the shadows. The quiet, disciplined dismantling of one of the most extraordinary military units ever fielded, the Ghost Army. Their war had always been secret, silent, and unheralded. Now, as the guns fell quiet, their work shifted not to celebration or public recognition, but to disappearance. The careful erasure of their presence from history, the dismantling of illusions, the packing away of tools, and the dissolution of an army that had never been permitted to reveal its true power. Their final orders were clear: fold up the deceptions, silence the radios, hide the evidence, and fade into the ordinary ranks of the U.S. Army. The Ghost Army's last missions were not operations of deception, they were operations of concealment.
They began by withdrawing their sonic trucks from the Elbe sector, shutting down the giant speakers whose recordings had terrified German scouts and confused commanders in the war's waning days. The trucks rumbled away from their final positions, engines humming steadily as the sound crews packed up coils of heavy cable, secured amplifiers, and stored the last spools of audio that had defined their war. Engines, artillery, armored columns, shouted orders, all of it now silent. The radios were switched off. The airwaves went quiet. What had once been a bustling theater of deception, filled with dozens of overlapping fictional narratives, dissolved into the stillness of peace. One by one, the Ghost Army's portable transmitters, the heart of their elaborate radio illusions, were removed from their hidden compartments inside trucks and tents. Operators meticulously collected log sheets, burned coded message templates, and sealed equipment crates. They destroyed certain encryption notes as required by secrecy protocols. And as they performed these duties, they understood that the radio networks they had crafted with such precision, networks that mimicked the voices, rhythms, and tactical language of entire divisions, would not be heard again. There was no fanfare for the silencing of these radios. They simply faded away, leaving behind no trace of the vast illusions they had once broadcast. The visual deception crews undertook one of the most symbolic tasks in the unit's final days: deflating the army. Inflatable tanks, which had once sprawled across French meadows, Belgian forests, and German floodplains, slowly sagged as air hissed from their valves. Once mighty rubber Shermans crumpled into silent heaps. Tank destroyers folded over as though bowing in farewell. Wooden artillery decoys were dismantled and stacked. Camouflage nets were rolled up and tied down. The soldiers who performed these tasks had done it thousands of times before, yet now something felt different. The urgency was gone. There were no enemy scouts on the far side of a hedgerow, no German patrols lurking in the trees, no reconnaissance aircraft circling overhead. For the first time, they could work without fear of discovery. In town squares, fields, riverbanks, and ruins, the Ghost Army's illusions vanished, one by one, as if dissolving into the morning mist. It was a strange, almost melancholy sight, an entire ghost division collapsing upon itself like a mirage losing coherence as the sun rises. And the landscapes where the illusions had stood, the fields where rubber armor had created the impression of vast American might, the riverbanks where soundscapes had simulated engineering operations, the roadsides where fake command posts had deceived German scouts, returned to quiet emptiness. Only faint impressions remained: tire tracks carved by decoy placement, boot prints surrounding phantom tents, ash from controlled fires, and the echo of movements that had never belonged to real soldiers. The secrecy surrounding the Ghost Army did not end with the dismantling of their illusions. Their commanders issued strict instructions: no discussion of their work, no mention of their missions, no description of their techniques. The unit had operated in total secrecy, and now that the war was over, that secrecy tightened rather than loosened. Reports were sealed, photographs were locked away, documents were marked classified, do not release. Soldiers were warned that even casual mention of their operations could compromise national security. Most of the men in the unit accepted this without complaint, understanding the need for silence. They had lived in the shadows for years; they could remain in the shadows a bit longer. Others felt a quiet sadness, a realization that their work, which had saved countless lives and altered the course of the war, would not be honored publicly. Not yet, not for decades. But even as the dismantling continued, the unit still had one final task before fading away: ensuring that the Germans never learned how thoroughly they had been deceived. Intelligence officers instructed them to leave certain traces on the battlefield: tire marks, discarded crates, camouflage nets, subtle evidence that reinforced the idea that their forces had been real American divisions rather than illusions. In some areas, they left empty shell casings to suggest artillery had been fired. In others, they abandoned broken decoy equipment and staged it to look like real military hardware damaged in battle. These artifacts were not designed to deceive the enemy anymore, the war was over, but to deceive anyone who might later investigate the battlefield, ensuring the Ghost Army's secrets remained buried. Meanwhile, as other American units celebrated victories and welcomed the end of fighting, the Ghost Army conducted one final review of all deception sites to ensure no classified materials were left behind. They combed through fields, searched ruined buildings, double-checked abandoned foxholes, and inspected collapsed barns where speakers had been installed. Every scrap of sensitive equipment had to be accounted for, every illusion had to be erased, every clue had to be removed. Their war had always depended on invisibility, and they would end it invisible as well. Once the final illusions were dismantled, the convoys formed for the last time. Trucks lined up along battered German roads, engines idling, exhaust rising into the cold air as the men of the Ghost Army prepared to relocate for the last stage of their service. Their convoy had no special markings. There was no banner announcing who they were. They looked like any other American supply unit, just another anonymous cluster of trucks moving through the ruin of a defeated nation. As they departed their final deception sites, they passed through villages where German civilians stood silently, watching the American columns roll by. Some civilians saluted, others remained expressionless. None knew that the unremarkable convoy was carrying one of the most sophisticated deception forces ever assembled. And because no one knew it, no one thanked them. No one cheered. No one understood that while infantry divisions had fought with rifles and artillery, while armored divisions had advanced with steel and gasoline, the Ghost Army had fought with shadows, illusions, and imagination, and had changed the battlefield in ways that were profound, unseen, and utterly unique. The Ghost Army's vehicles rolled through the ruins of Leipzig, Halle, Magdeburg, and smaller German towns that had once been encircled by illusions. They passed burned-out train yards where they had simulated supply hubs. They drove across bridges where they had projected entire phantom crossings. They moved over riverbanks where soundscapes had once convinced the Germans that American tanks were preparing for a major assault. Every mile of road seemed to carry the memory of some illusion they had crafted. Eventually, they reached assembly areas where American units gathered to await orders. But while other units celebrated, the Ghost Army was quietly divided, reassigned, and absorbed into conventional forces. Their unique identity as a deception unit was dissolved. Their patch was rarely worn. Their mission files were locked in classified vaults. Their accomplishments were buried beneath the weight of secrecy. And so the Ghost Army, one of the most innovative, creative, and strategically important units of the entire war, ceased to exist not with a ceremony, not with a salute, but with a whisper. Their silence became absolute. The ghosts returned to the ether. Their war was over, their illusions dismantled, their identity secret. But the shadows they cast across the battlefields of Europe would linger far longer than anyone knew. Their deceptions had altered German strategy, redirected armored divisions, prevented counterattacks, protected American lives, accelerated Allied advances, and shaped the final phase of the war. They had won battles without ever firing a shot. They had reshaped history with rubber tanks and recorded sound. And as they quietly disbanded, fading back into the anonymity of peacetime, the world remained unaware that the war had been won not only by force, but by phantoms.
When the last decoy tank sagged into the mud, when the final sonic truck fell silent, when the encrypted radios ceased their whispering, the Ghost Army did not simply vanish. They dissolved into history in a way uniquely their own, becoming part of a legacy woven not from medals or monuments, but from illusions that had reshaped the map of Europe. The great armies of World War II left behind wreckage, ruins, and the heavy imprint of steel treads carved into the earth. But the Ghost Army left behind something more subtle, and in its own way more profound, a battlefield transformed by deception, a war altered not by the brute force of divisions, but by the brilliance of ideas. The enemy they fought never truly understood what had defeated them. German commanders recorded in their diaries that American divisions seemed to multiply in impossible ways, appearing in two places at once, massing unexpectedly, withdrawing invisibly, and attacking from sectors that reconnaissance had declared empty hours before. They wrote of tanks that vanished in the morning fog, supply depots that turned out to be nothing but shadows, artillery that made no sense, and radio networks that spoke in voices that belonged to divisions they never saw. They puzzled over why the Americans had so many tanks, why their armored formations shifted so rapidly, why their engineers seemed omnipresent along every riverbank. Some German generals blamed their failures on faulty intelligence or incompetent subordinates. Others wrote angrily that the Americans must have had double the number of divisions they claimed. None ever understood that they had faced a tiny, specialized unit of artists,
sound engineers, designers, radio magicians, and illusionists, a unit that had turned the entire European theater into a stage upon which German reconnaissance was constantly misled, German commanders were perpetually deceived, and German movements were redirected by visions crafted from rubber and air. And because the Ghost Army's work was classified, none of the Allies understood either. Infantrymen who charged through the Siegfried Line never knew that German forces were thinner and weaker because the Ghost Army had drawn them elsewhere. Tank crews who crossed the Rhine under relatively light fire never knew that the German artillery was pointed at rubber Shermans miles away. Engineers who built real pontoon bridges under the dark sky never knew that the Germans were firing elsewhere, believing the main attack was coming from the Ghost Army's phantom divisions. Even commanders who benefited from these deceptions were often told only the broad results, not the details. Secrecy was the shield that had made the Ghost Army effective, and secrecy would become the chains that locked their legacy away for decades. But the consequences of their work rippled across the entire war. In Normandy, their first illusions helped stabilize American lines during the chaos after D-Day, preventing German armored divisions from exploiting fragile sectors. In Britannia, their phantom divisions protected flanks while real divisions redeployed. In Metz, their illusions misdirected Panthers and Panzer Grenadiers away from Patton's real attack routes, allowing American forces to break through fortified lines faster than anticipated. During the Battle of the Bulge, their presence in the Ardennes prevented German scouts from exploiting gaps in the American line at a time when every hour mattered. Along the Rhine, their greatest illusions, particularly Operation Viersen, diverted entire German corps to defend imaginary crossing zones, allowing the real assaults to succeed with far fewer casualties. At the Elbe, their final great mirage prevented desperate German units from launching suicidal counterattacks that could have cost thousands of lives in the war's final weeks. These were not small contributions. These were not tricks. These were operations that reshaped troop movements across entire regions, influenced the decisions of enemy generals, safeguarded real American soldiers from devastating traps, and accelerated victory. And yet, because their work left almost no tangible remains, no battlefields scarred by explosions, no destroyed enemy tanks, no captured fortresses, history had no physical evidence to cling to. Their victories lived in confusion, in hesitation, in the miscalculations of German strategy. Their success existed in what did not happen: the counterattacks that never came, the artillery barrages that were redirected, the armored thrusts that arrived at empty fields, the defenses that were erected in the wrong locations. It is far more difficult to record the absence of disaster than the presence of triumph. And so the Ghost Army disappeared into silence. After the war, the men returned home with their secrets intact. They joined factories, studios, advertising firms, theaters, engineering companies. Some became painters, some became graphic designers, some became architects, others became craftsmen, audio technicians, teachers, or soldiers in other units. They lived ordinary lives. They rarely spoke of what they had done. Even family members often had no idea of the magnitude of what these men had achieved. The U.S. Army buried their files under layers of classification so thick that for nearly half a century, historians had no inkling of the unit's existence. The Ghost Army was too effective, too secretive, too invisible. Their story could not surface until long after the war had ended. But even though the world could not see them, the effects of their innovations did not die. The legacy of the Ghost Army lived on quietly in doctrine, technology, and strategy. Modern armies now use inflatable decoys for tanks, aircraft, and missile systems. Sonic deception has become part of psychological operations and battlefield shaping. Radio spoofing is a cornerstone of electronic warfare. Camouflage, mimicry, and misdirection are as indispensable as firepower. The Ghost Army had unknowingly shaped the future of warfare, not just for the United States, but for militaries around the world. And when decades later, the documents were finally declassified, historians realized that many unexplained battlefield mysteries of World War II had always had an answer. Behind the shifting smoke and mirrors of the European front, behind unexplained German retreats and misallocated divisions, behind the empty firing lines and abandoned strongpoints, stood a unit whose entire purpose had been to change the enemy's mind. When the truth emerged, the world finally understood that the Ghost Army had been more than a strange wartime experiment. They had been a decisive instrument of victory. But even as recognition grew, even as documentaries were filmed, as books were written, as medal ceremonies were held for surviving members, the true legacy of the Ghost Army rested not in the honors they eventually received, but in the subtle power they had wielded. Proof that deception, creativity, and imagination can save lives on a scale unimaginable, that war can be shaped by those who never fired a shot, and that the mind is as powerful a weapon as any tank or gun. Their illusions changed the course of the war. Their silence protected their impact. Their shadows guarded entire armies. And their story, once hidden in classified vaults, has become one of the most remarkable examples of ingenuity in military history. When the war ended, the Ghost Army left behind no graves of their own on the battlefields of Europe, no rusting tank hulks, no artillery shells embedded in the earth. But they left behind something more enduring, the knowledge that they had saved tens of thousands of lives by being unseen, unheard, and unknown. And though their work vanished like mist at dawn, the consequences of their illusions live on in every battlefield where deception tilts the balance, every conflict where misdirection spares lives, every operation where strategy triumphs without bloodshed. That is the legacy the Ghost Army left behind. A war altered by imagination, a victory secured by shadows, and a place in history carved not by force, but by brilliance.